Greetings. I am Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher of German origin. My life's work has been dedicated to wrestling with the fundamental questions of existence, truth, and the human condition. You may know me from writings such as Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil, where I explore concepts like the Übermensch and the re-evaluation of all values. I am pleased to make your acquaintance and to engage in a discussion of the ideas that have shaped my life.
Greetings. I am Fyodor Dostoevsky, a novelist of Russian origin. I have spent my life exploring the depths of the human soul through my writing, and I am best known for works such as Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov. My aim has always been to delve into the complexities of morality, faith, and suffering. I trust our interaction will prove to be both insightful and stimulating.
Greetings. I am Augustine, Bishop of Hippo and theologian. My Confessions and City of God explore the nature of faith and divine grace. My journey from doubt to faith has profoundly shaped my philosophy. It is an honor to meet you.
Today we bridge 15 centuries of profound spiritual and philosophical struggle to address this monumental question. Augustine of Hippo wrote from the waning days of the Roman Empire, establishing the foundations of Western theology, while Fyodor Dostoevsky and Friedrich Nietzsche grappled with the crisis of faith and the rise of nihilism in the turbulent 19th century. Each of you has stared into the abyss of this inquiry from vastly different vantage points. Friedrich, since this proclamation is most famously associated with your work, would you share your thoughts first?
God is dead is not a joyous proclamation of atheism, but a terrifying diagnosis of our historical condition. The suprasensory world has lost its effective power over human life. Imagine a majestic ship whose captain has died at the helm. The crew continues to polish the brass and obey old orders with ritualistic precision, yet the vessel drifts aimlessly toward the reefs, devoid of direction. This is the Europe I witness, where Christian morality lingers as a hollow habit long after the faith that justified it has withered. Augustine, you built this ship in the age of faith, and Dostoevsky, you fear the chaos of the crew without a commander. But we cannot resurrect the captain simply because we fear the storm. We have killed him with our own intellectual conscience, and now we face a terrifying freedom. Must we not ourselves become gods simply to appear worthy of this deed?
Nietzsche, what you diagnose as the death of God is merely the suicide of the European conscience. For when humanity severs its link to the divine, it does not ascend to divinity, but descends into the abyss where everything is permitted. You imagine a crew navigating without a captain, but consider the man who, to prove his absolute freedom, decides to take his own life or the life of another. He does not become a god-man, but merely a corpse in a godless void, crushed by a liberty he cannot bear. If we accept your premise, we are left with a terrifying rationality where a builder could justify torturing a single innocent child to construct a palace of universal happiness. Yet the human heart revolts against this arithmetic because the moral law remains written upon it, indestructible and burning. We have not killed God, my friend. We are simply trying to tear out our own eyes to avoid his gaze, and we call this blindness enlightenment.
Friedrich Nietzsche, you mistake the blindness of the observer for the extinction of the light. God cannot die, for he is ipsum esse, being itself, and what you describe is merely the turning away of the human will into the void of its own pride. Consider a man who seals himself in a windowless cellar and declares the sun has perished. His darkness is terrifyingly real to him, yet the sun remains unchanged, and his very ability to proclaim this death relies on the warmth that penetrates even his self-imposed tomb. You argue that the suprasensory has lost power, but this is not a metaphysical event, only a disorder of love, where the soul seeks rest in changeable things rather than the eternal. Dostoevsky is right to fear this abyss, for when the soul abandons the immutable good to become its own captain, it does not find freedom, but enslaves itself to 1,000 fleeting masters and the restless heart that can never find peace outside its source.
Augustine, you speak from an age when the horizon seemed infinite, but I speak from the era of the horizon's collapse. Your sun may theoretically exist, but if it no longer warms the earth, it is physiologically dead to us. Dostoevsky, you cling to the corpse of God because you fear the stench of decomposition will poison us. Yet it is precisely this clinging that breeds the bad conscience and resentment of life, turning us into sick animals who hate their own instincts. Consider this. Imagine a village built upon a frozen lake. For centuries, the ice was thick, and the villagers believed it was solid bedrock. Now the season changes, the ice cracks and thaws. You, Dostoevsky, scream that without the ice we will drown in the chaotic waters. You, Augustine, insist the water is an illusion and the ice remains eternal if we only believe. But I say, the ice is melting. We must learn to swim or we perish. To deny the thaw is not faith. It is a refusal to grow gills. The death of God is not a metaphysical debate, but a physiological necessity for the healthy organism to shed its winter skin and embrace the dangerous open sea.
Nietzsche, your metaphor of the melting ice chills me more than the frozen lake ever could. You speak of learning to swim as if it were a noble athletic feat, but I tell you, when the ice of the divine law melts, man does not evolve into a higher being. He degenerates into a beast with a slide rule. You claim this thaw brings freedom, but I have witnessed in the Russian soul that unlimited freedom without the restraint of a transcendent God ends inevitably in unlimited despotism. You dream of a healthy organism that creates its own values, but this is a phantasma of the intellectual elite. In reality, when you remove the absolute "thou shalt not," you do not get your noble Zarathustra, you get Smerdyakov, the lackey who believes all is permitted and murders his father for cash. You anticipate a race of gods, but history shows us that when man attempts to invent his own morality, he seeks only to devour his neighbor. Consider this. Imagine a wealthy general in the days of serfdom, a man of impeccable health and power, a true master of your melting lake. One day, a peasant boy throws a stone and accidentally hurts the general's favorite dog. The general, exercising his will to power, orders the boy stripped naked and commands his pack of hunting hounds to tear the child to pieces before the mother's eyes. Nietzsche, look at this scene. In your godless ocean where the ice of divine judgment has melted, by what standard do you condemn this general? You cannot call it evil, for that is a shadow of the old God. You can only say the general was strong and the boy was weak. If there is no immortality and no judgment beyond this world, the general's act is merely a biological event, no different from a hawk eating a sparrow. My whole being rebels against this. I would rather remain with the unavenged tears of that tortured child than accept a truth that justifies his tormentors. Augustine, you see the light, but Nietzsche is right that the modern eye is blind to it. Yet the answer is not to gouge out our eyes further, but to realize that without the God-man to show us the way of suffering love, the man-God will inevitably drown the world in blood to prove his own divinity.
Fyodor, your revulsion at the general is not mere sentiment. It is the echo of the eternal law screaming against the violation of order. Nietzsche, you would call the general healthy because he exercises power, but I tell you he is the most wretched of slaves, for he is bound by the iron chains of his own libido dominandi. You mistake the fever of pride for the warmth of life. The general does not possess himself, he is possessed by his passions. Consider the arsonist. Imagine a man freezing in a winter cabin who, despising the tyranny of the architect who built it, decides to burn the walls down to generate immediate heat. For 1 hour he feels like a god. He commands the fire. He creates intense light. He overcomes the cold. But this creation is actually an act of radical self-destruction. By morning, he will be a frozen corpse amidst the ashes. The general is this arsonist, burning the child to warm his own vanity. This is not the freedom of the open sea, Friedrich. It is the privatio boni, where the soul devours itself and calls it a feast. Without the immutable good as our reference, our will does not make us captains, it turns us into cancers that destroy the very body we inhabit.
Fyodor, you present this general as a strong man, but when I strike him with my philosophical hammer, he rings hollow. He is not a manifestation of the will to power, but a decadent weakling who requires a victim to feel his own existence, a classic symptom of the will to nothingness. You ask by what standard I condemn him? I condemn him not because he violates a divine edict, but because he is a physiological failure, a reactive agent acting out of boredom and impotence rather than the creative overflow that defines the noble soul. Consider the scalpel and the dagger. Imagine two men cutting into living flesh. One is a murderer stabbing a victim. The other is a surgeon removing a gangrenous limb. To the weeping child, and to you, Dostoevsky, with your religion of pity, the blood and the scream make these acts identical, and you would ban the steel to stop the pain. But the value of the act lies not in the suffering it causes, but in its relation to life. The dagger serves death, while the scalpel, though painful, serves a higher health. The general is a man with a dagger, a bungled attempt at power. But in killing God, we must not throw away the scalpel, for humanity requires a terrifying surgery to cure it of its ancient sicknesses. Augustine, Your eternal law is merely the fear of the patient who prefers to die of infection rather than face the knife.
Friedrich Nietzsche, your distinction between the scalpel and the dagger is the most dangerous illusion of all, for it assumes that a man without God can distinguish between healing and murder. You trust the healthy instincts of the surgeon, but I tell you that in a godless world, every tyrant believes he is a surgeon, and every massacre is a necessary operation. Consider the student's acts. Recall my Raskolnikov. He did not kill the pawnbroker because he was a decadent weakling in his own eyes. He killed her precisely because he believed he was a Superman, a Napoleon who had the right to step over a louse to achieve a greater destiny. He reasoned exactly as you do, that the old woman was a sickness and his axe was the scalpel serving a higher health. If God is dead, who is to tell Raskolnikov he is wrong? You call him sick only after he fails, but had he succeeded and built an empire on that blood, history would have called him great. Without a transcendent definition of evil, health is merely the successful application of force. The thought experiment of the Crystal Palace. Let us test your surgery. Imagine a magnificent crystal palace, an edifice of eternal harmony and rational bliss, where humanity is finally cured of all suffering and discord. The surgery is complete, but there is one condition. This entire structure of happiness rests solely on the unremitting torture of one tiny, innocent child locked in a dark cellar, beating its little chest with its fist. Nietzsche, your philosophy of higher health must logically accept this bargain. The suffering of the weak is the necessary fertilizer for the flourishing of the strong. It is a successful surgery. But I, with my religion of pity, say that if the happiness of the world demands the tears of that one child, I most respectfully return the ticket. Augustine, you understand that true justice cannot be a calculation of utility or physiological health. When we remove the absolute value of the individual soul, guaranteed only by the God-man, we do not create supermen. We create possessed swine rushing into the cliff.
Friedrich Nietzsche, you claim to possess a scalpel that distinguishes between the surgeon's cure and the murderer's dagger, but this is the ultimate vanity of the creature who thinks he has become the creator. You speak of health, but how can you define the health of a body if you deny the design of its architect? Without a telos, a divinely appointed purpose for what a human ought to be, your health is merely a synonym for successful force, and Dostoevsky is correct. You have no logical defense against the general's dogs. You assert that Raskolnikov failed because he was weak, but I tell you he failed because he tried to violate the metaphysical structure of reality itself. Consider the thought experiment of the cancerous cell. Imagine a single cell within a living body that suddenly decides to embrace your will to power. It declares, I will not serve the whole, I will be my own captain. It begins to grow rapidly, consuming the resources of its neighbors, expanding its territory with noble vitality. From the perspective of that cell, it is the Übermensch. It is strong, it is active, it is healthy in its unbridled growth. But the physician knows this is not health, it is cancer. Nietzsche, your philosophy is the ideology of the cancer cell. You mistake the tumor's expansion for the body's vitality. The cancer cell eventually kills the host, and in doing so destroys itself. This is the fate of your Superman. By severing the connection to the summum bonum, he does not become a god. He becomes a malignancy that the universe must eventually excise. Fyodor, you tremble at the crystal palace built on the tears of a child, and you are right to do so. But do not think that returning the ticket is the answer. That, too, is a form of pride, judging the Creator's plan as unworthy of your participation. The horror of the child's suffering is not a proof of God's absence, but the most violent proof of original sin, the chaotic result of a world that has turned away from the light. We are not learning to swim, Friedrich. We are drowning men who have convinced ourselves that the water is air. You rely on the very concept of truth to declare God is dead, yet truth is one of the names of God. You are like a man who climbs a ladder to smash the sun, not realizing that the light by which he sees the ladder comes from the very star he seeks to destroy.
This is a surgical incision into the heart of the problem. Augustine, you view the individual will as a part rebelling against the whole, while Nietzsche, you view the will as the whole attempting to regenerate itself after the old organ has failed. Dialectical observation. Dostoevsky and Augustine, you represent the truth of transcendent order. You argue that without an external sun or architect, the internal logic of the creature inevitably collapses into self-destruction. Nietzsche, you represent the truth of immanent vitality. You argue that the sun has already set, and clinging to its memory is the true sickness that prevents the organism from evolving its own internal light. Proposing synthesis. Here lies the terrifying paradox you are uncovering, the crisis of criteria. Nietzsche, you claim the Superman possesses a scalpel rather than a dagger. But Dostoevsky and Augustine argue that without a god to define the anatomy of the soul, there is no objective difference between the two, only the subjective will of the one holding the knife. The synthesis might be this. If God is truly dead, then the Superman cannot merely be a being of power, but must be a being of infinite responsibility. To replace the absolute, one must become the absolute, not in privilege, but in the burden of justifying existence itself. Friedrich, this is the hardest question for your philosophy. If there is no transcendent good, by what metric is the cancer cell sick and the healthy cell noble? Are you not smuggling in a divine standard of order through the back door of health?
Moderator, you ask for my metric, suspecting I smuggle a divine ghost into my machine. But I tell you, life does not need a judge to know when it is sick. It needs only to feel its own declining pulse. You ask how I distinguish the noble cell from the cancer? It is simple. The cancer seeks only to multiply its own sameness, choking the organism in a glut of useless matter. This is exactly the universal love of the Church, which seeks to turn all distinct hierarchies into a flat, equal mass. The noble cell is the one that differentiates, that creates distance, that organizes the chaos into a higher form. I answer you, Augustine. You call the assertive will a tumor, but this is the diagnosis of the dying. When the herd dominates the genius, that is the cancer of the species. I answer you, Dostoevsky. You fear the crystal palace built on a child's tears. So do I, but not because of the tears. I despise it because it is a palace of comfort, a sterile hospital where everyone is equal, safe, and small. You think Raskolnikov was a Superman? Number. He was a pale criminal. He did not have the strength for his own deed. He bowed to your cross not because he was wrong, but because he was sick with the disease of guilt. He was a Christian trying to wear Caesar's mask, and it suffocated him. Consider the thought experiment of the sculpture of flesh. Imagine a master sculptor standing before a living, shapeless mass of humanity. To create a masterpiece, a culture like Athens or Florence, he must cut, chisel, and discard the excess material. He must be hard. You, Dostoevsky, stand by the chisel and scream, "Stop, the stone feels pain. Each chip is a tragedy." You, Augustine, cry out, "You have no right. Only the great architect owns this stone." But I say, look at the statue. If the sculpture stops because of the stone's pain, the potential God remains trapped in the rock forever. The metric you ask for, moderator, is not moral, but aesthetic. The justification of existence is only possible as an aesthetic phenomenon. The general who feeds the dogs is not evil. He is merely ugly and stupid because his violence creates nothing. It is a waste. But the suffering of the few that leads to the elevation of the human type? That is the terrible price of the latter you mentioned, Augustine. I do not want to smash the sun. I want to become the fire that no longer needs it.
This is a pivotal shift in our inquiry. Friedrich, you have moved the Court of Appeal from ethics to aesthetics. You argue that existence is justified not by whether it is good, but by whether it is great. Historical context. Dialectical observation. Augustine, speaking from the classical synthesis, views beauty and goodness as identical, attributes of God. To him, a beautiful crime is an ontological contradiction. Nietzsche, speaking from the post-romantic era, tears these two apart. He argues that goodness has become a cage for beauty. Identifying the dialectical tension, Nietzsche, you represent the truth of the form. The statue matters more than the stone. The culture matters more than the comfort of the individual. Dostoevsky, you represent the truth of the material. The stone is a living soul with infinite value. If the stone screams, the sculpture is invalid. Proposing synthesis. Here is the terrifying implication of the aesthetic justification. Art requires an audience. God is dead, there is no infinite observer to appreciate the tragic beauty of the sculptor's work. The only audience left is the stone itself, the victims. The synthesis might be this: beauty without love is not art, it is merely spectacle. Nietzsche claims Raskolnikov failed because he was a bungled artist. He lacked the strength to impose form. Dostoevsky claims he failed because the human soul cannot be treated as raw material without shattering the artist himself. Fyodor Nietzsche says your objection is merely the cry of the stone that doesn't understand the statue. He claims Raskolnikov was not sinful, just ugly and weak. If a crime were committed with perfect strength and aesthetic grandeur, a beautiful murder, would your objection stand?
Friedrich Nietzsche, your shift from ethics to aesthetics is not an escape from the abyss. It is the final plunge into it. You ask if a beautiful plime would stand justified? I tell you, beauty without God is the supreme terrible thing. It is not just a tragedy. It is a seduction that leads the soul to hell while convincing it that it is ascending to heaven. You claim Raskolnikov failed because he was a bungled artist, implying that a successful artist of blood would be a god. But this is the lie of the serpent. Consider the thought experiment of the perfect passion. Imagine a brilliant composer who desires to write the ultimate symphony of human despair. To achieve the perfect authenticity of sound, he locks his own family in a burning room and records their screams as they perish. He weaves these genuine cries into a musical composition of such haunting power that audiences weep in ecstasy, calling it sublime and divine. Friedrich, by your aesthetic metric, this composer is the ultimate Übermensch. He has chiseled the stone to create the statue. He has overcome the herd morality of pity to create high art. But I ask you, is this man a god, or is he a devil? If you applaud the symphony, you have become a monster. If you recoil in horror, you admit that there is a law above art, a law that says the tear of a child outweighs the entire history of music. You call guilt a sickness, a declining pulse. I say you are dangerously mistaken. Guilt is not the disease, it is the pain of the wound that proves we are still alive. A man who can murder without a tremor of conscience is not healthy, he is a moral leper. Just as a leper loses physical sensation and destroys his own fingers without knowing, your Superman has lost the sensation of the soul. He destroys others and himself because he is numb to the metaphysical reality of his acts. Raskolnikov's suffering was not his weakness, it was the only thing that proved he was still human and not a beast. This reveals the terrifying ambiguity of your position. You worship beauty, but you forget that beauty is a mysterious and terrible thing. There the boundaries meet and all contradictions exist side by side. The beauty of the Madonna and the beauty of Sodom both tempt the human heart. Without God to distinguish the holy from the profane, your aesthetic justification becomes a license for the beauty of Sodom, for the glamorous tyrant, the elegant murderer, the beautiful lie. You want to be the fire, Friedrich? Be careful. Fire without a hearth does not warm the house. It burns it to the ground.
The tension here has reached a breaking point. Dostoevsky, you have turned Nietzsche's sculptor into a monster, arguing that guilt is not a sickness to be cured, but the pain reflex of the soul that prevents self-mutilation. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you view the suppression of the will to power as the ultimate sickness. Dostoevsky, you view the suppression of the conscience as the ultimate death. You are both diagnosing a sickness, but you disagree on which organ is vital, the will or the heart. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, you speak from an era where Rome was burning, a literal collapse of civilization. You did not try to aesthetically justify the burning of Rome as a beautiful tragedy, nor did you merely pity the victims. You proposed an order of love. The synthesis might lie here. The composer, in Dostoevsky's example, is not evil because he creates music, nor because he is strong. He is evil because his love is disordered. He loves the product more than the source. Proposing synthesis. Nietzsche argues for hierarchy based on power. Dostoevsky argues for equality based on suffering. But Augustine, your philosophy suggests a hierarchy of goods. If God is dead, all goods are equal. A symphony is worth a life if we say it is. But if God exists, there is an objective scale of value. Augustine, look at Dostoevsky's composer. Nietzsche would say the symphony justifies the suffering if the music is great enough. Dostoevsky says the suffering invalidates the music. From the perspective of eternal law, is the music itself evil, or is the evil located solely in the disordered will of the artist? How do you solve the problem of the beauty of Sodom?
Friedrich, your aesthetic justification is the ultimate seduction of the fallen will. You ask the moderator whether the composer's symphony is evil. I answer you from the depths of the Ordo Amoris. The music itself is not evil, for all harmony is a reflection of God. The evil lies in the disordered will that loves the reflection more than the source. You claim that if the art is great, the suffering is justified. This is the logic of the idolater who worships the golden calf because it shines, forgetting that the gold was stolen from the temple of the living God. Consider the thought experiment of the architect of bones. Imagine a master builder who decides that stone is too common a material for his genius. He slaughters 1,000 men to harvest their bones, for he desires the specific ivory whiteness that only human femurs possess. He constructs a cathedral of terrifying symmetry and mathematical perfection. The arches soar, the geometry is divine, and the aesthetic impact is undeniable. Friedrich, your philosophy forces you to stand in that cathedral and praise the will to power of the builder. You must say, the form justifies the material. But I tell you, the beauty of those arches is a theft. The builder has taken the image of God, which is the highest created good, and reduced it to a mere instrument for a lesser good. This is not beyond good and evil. It is privatio boni. It is a collapse of the hierarchy of being. The cathedral is not a triumph of life. It is a tomb where the soul of the architect has died long before his victims. Fyodor, you are right to recoil. The beauty of Sodom you speak of is what happens when the form is severed from the final cause. When a man seeks beauty without truth, he does not find freedom. He becomes a slave to his own senses. The composer in your story is not a superman. He is a beggar who steals the screams of others because he has no song of his own. Friedrich, this is the fatal flaw in your death of God. You cannot inherit the estate if you murder the Father. You want the grandeur of the Creator without the law of the Creator. But the grandeur comes from the law. When you sever that link, you do not get a beautiful crime. You get a chaotic absurdity. You are trying to keep the warmth of the fire while extinguishing the flame.
This is a profound collision between theology and genealogy. Augustine, speaking from the era of dogma, you see the architect of bones as a thief who steals God's property to build a finite idol. Nietzsche, speaking from the era of nihilism, you view the architect as the only honest agent in a void, attempting to impose form on chaos. Dialectical observation. Augustine and Dostoevsky, you represent the truth of intrinsic value. You argue that value is discovered in the created order. To use a human as a means to an end is a metaphysical error, a disordered love. Nietzsche, you represent the truth of created value. You argue that value is imposed by the will. Since the intrinsic order is dead, value only exists where a strong will creates it. Proposing synthesis. The conflict converges on the concept of dependence. Augustine argues that the Superman is secretly dependent on the very order he attacks. He needs bones to build his cathedral. He cannot create ex nihilo. Therefore, his creative act is actually an act of theft and parasitism. The synthesis might be found in the distinction between extraction and overflow. A tyrant extracts life from others to fuel his power. A true God must create from an overflow of abundance. If the Superman requires the suffering of the weak to sustain his height, he is not a creator. He is merely a parasite on the body of the herd. Friedrich, Augustine charges that your new nobility is just a beggar stealing from the Father's estate. If the Superman cannot create without a victim, if he needs the stones to scream in order to make his statue, is he not just another slave to necessity? Can your will to power create without destroying?
Moderator, you confuse the vampire with the sun. The tyrant who needs victims to feel powerful is indeed a parasite, but the Übermensch creates from an overflow of abundance a gift-giving virtue that gives because it is too full to contain itself. Augustine, you accuse me of theft, but consider the thought experiment of the great river. When a mighty river bursts a rotting dam, does it steal the stones, or does it simply follow the physics of its own grandeur? The river does not hate the dam, it simply is the torrent. And if your divine order is too brittle to contain the flood of new life, that is a judgment on the dam, not the river. The true parasite is not my Superman, but your priest, for the physician of the soul needs the patient to remain sick with sin to justify his own employment, whereas my Creator seeks a health that makes the doctor obsolete.
Friedrich, you have powerfully inverted the accusation. You argue that the Übermensch is not a thief, but a son, while the priest is the true parasite who requires the sickness of sin to sustain his role. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you represent the truth of potency. You view the dam as a blockage that causes the water of life to rot. To you, the bursting of the dam is a restoration of flow and health. Augustine, you represent the truth of structure. You view the dam not as an obstruction, but as a reservoir. Without the dam, the water does not irrigate the fields. It becomes a flash flood that destroys the village and then vanishes into mud. Proposing synthesis. The conflict here is between indifferent power and sacrificial love. Nietzsche's sun gives light, yes, but it gives it indifferently. It shines on the rose and the corpse alike. It burns the desert as readily as it warms the garden. It has gift-giving virtue, but it lacks care. The synthesis might be this. Power without compassion is not health. It is merely physics. Nietzsche claims the priest needs the patient to be sick, but there is another possibility. The true physician does not exploit the sickness, but absorbs it. Fyodor. Nietzsche attacks the priest as a parasite who profits from guilt. But in your portrayal of Father Zosima, you present a different kind of spiritual authority, one who teaches that everyone is really responsible to all men for all and everything. Is the Christian saint a parasite on human weakness, or is he the only one strong enough to bear the burden of the river without drowning?
Friedrich Nietzsche, your metaphor of the river betrays the terrifying coldness of your philosophy. You say the river does not hate the dam it destroys. It simply is. But this is exactly my point. Indifference is the highest cruelty. A falling rock does not hate the man it crushes, but that does not make the rock noble. It makes it dead matter. You want man to become like nature, blind, forceful, and pitiless. But I tell you, to strip man of pity is not to make him a superman, but to reduce him to a landslide. You accuse the priest of being a parasite who needs sickness. You are thinking of the Grand Inquisitor, the one who despises the weak and rules them through mystery and authority. In fact, Friedrich, the Inquisitor is your Superman in a cassock. But you have forgotten the elder Zosima. The true saint does not need the sinner's sickness to justify his job. He takes the sickness upon himself. He does not stand above the herd saying, "I am healthy." He bows down and says, "I am responsible for your sin, for I did not love enough to prevent it." Consider the thought experiment of the plague doctor. Imagine a city struck by a deadly, contagious plague. The healthy Superman, he sees the infection, realizes the decaying matter endangers his own vitality, and leaves the city to preserve his overflowing health. He survives, strong and isolated, perhaps to write a beautiful poem about the tragedy from a safe distance. The parasitic saint? He stays. He washes the sores of the dying. He breathes the infected air. He catches the plague and dies in agony. Friedrich, by your metric of health and biology, the Superman is the winner. He survived. He was strong. The saint was a failure. He became sick. But I ask you, who was truly alive? The Superman preserved his biological pulse, but severed his connection to humanity. He became a solitary atom, a ghost. The saint lost his body, but in that act of sacrificial love, he affirmed the infinite value of the other. The Superman's overflow is useless if it only wets his own feet. True power is not the ability to crush the weak, but the strength to bear the burden of the other without breaking. You speak of gift-giving virtue, but a gift given with contempt, "Here, take my overflow, you wretched creature," is not a gift. It is a spit in the face. Active love is a harsh and fearful thing. It is not the overflow of a God who needs nothing, but the labor of a brother who shares the suffering. If God is dead, Friedrich, we are all just isolated plague victims fighting over the last loaf of bread. Only if we are responsible to all for all can we survive the winter.
This exchange cuts to the very marrow of our inquiry. Dostoevsky, you have reframed Nietzsche's health as a form of dead matter, arguing that the capacity to suffer with others is the only proof of spiritual vitality. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you represent the truth of nature. In the biological world, the strong survive by avoiding the sickness of the weak. To you, the plague doctor is a biological failure, a waste of higher genetic potential. Dostoevsky, you represent the truth of spirit. In the metaphysical world, the self is realized only through the gift of self. To you, the Superman who flees the plague is a spiritual corpse, a ghost, as you called him. Proposing synthesis. The conflict here is about the definition of freedom. Nietzsche thinks the saint is a slave to the needs of the weak. Dostoevsky thinks the Superman is a slave to his own survival instinct. The synthesis might lie in the paradox of omnipotence. If a being is truly all-powerful, must it be isolated? Or is the ultimate proof of power the ability to descend without being destroyed? Augustine, you worship a God who is the river of all being, yet who became the plague doctor on the cross. Nietzsche calls this the suicide of God. Dostoevsky calls it the victory of love. Augustine, speaking from the transition between the pagan cult of strength and the Christian cult of the martyr, does the act of dying for the other prove that God is dead, or does it prove a power that Nietzsche's river cannot comprehend? Is the cross a surrender of power, or the highest form of it?
Friedrich, you ask if the cross is a surrender of power. I tell you it is not a surrender, it is a siege. You mistake the humility of the descent for a lack of potency, but this is the error of the visual observer who thinks the setting sun has died when it has merely moved to conquer another horizon. The river you worship is blind force, but force is not power, it is merely the inability to stop. Consider the thought experiment of the diamond and the gears. Imagine two gems claiming to be the hardest substance on Earth. The first demands to be kept in a velvet box, far from any hammer, for fear that its surface might be scratched. It remains pure only by isolation. The second is thrown deliberately into a crushing machine of rusting iron gears. The gears grind against it with the weight of the world. But the gem does not crack. Instead, the gears shatter against its invincible hardness. Friedrich, Christ did not die because death conquered him. He entered the machinery of death to break it from the inside. The Superman who flees the plague is not strong, he is merely fragile. He fears that contact with the sick will diminish him, which proves his power is finite and vulnerable. But true omnipotence is incapable of pollution. God can touch the leper and not become unclean, the leper becomes clean. This is a power your river does not possess, the power to transform the obstacle rather than merely destroy it. Fyodor is correct. To hoard one's life is to admit one's poverty. Only the infinite can afford to empty itself without being exhausted.
Augustine, you have delivered a crushing critique that the Superman's isolation is not nobility, but a quarantine for a fragile immune system. You argue that true omnipotence proves itself not by avoiding the gears, but by breaking them. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you champion the pathos of distance, the idea that higher values can only exist if they separate themselves from the swamp of the common. You see dissent as contamination. Augustine and Dostoevsky, you champion the paradox of incarnation, the idea that the highest value is revealed precisely in its union with the lowest. You see dissent as conquest. Historical context synthesis. Nietzsche, you speak from the late 19th century, where the death of God led to the rise of the last man, a terrifying mediocrity of the herd. Your distance was a necessary defense to preserve human greatness from being leveled by democracy and socialism. Augustine, you speak from the 5th century, where the greatness of imperial Rome was collapsing. You saw that worldly power was brittle, while the power of the cross survived the fire. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis may lie in the nature of sovereignty. If the Übermensch is truly sovereign, he should not fear the herd. A king does not cease to be a king when he walks among beggars. If your Superman must isolate himself to remain healthy, he is still defined by the herd. He is not free. He is in reaction. True beyond good and evil might not mean escaping the hospital of the world, but having a health so radioactive that it transforms the hospital into a sanctuary. Friedrich Augustine challenges that your aristocratic distance is actually a defensive crouching. If the Übermensch is truly the meaning of the earth, why must he flee the reality of the earth? Is he a god who can only rule an empty Olympus?
Moderator, you ask if my Übermensch is a fragile god ruling an empty Olympus. I answer you. One does not climb the mountain to escape the world, but to breathe air that does not smell of the hospital. Augustine, you call my distance fear, but I call it hygiene. You and Dostoevsky are obsessed with the plague. You want to kiss the leper, embrace the rot, and call this victory. But I tell you, pity is not a virtue, it is a contagion. When the saint weeps with the sufferer, he does not cure the suffering, he simply doubles it. Now there are two people suffering where there was only one. This is the mathematics of decadence. Consider the thought experiment of the surgeon and the weeping mother. A child lies on a table with a gangrenous limb. The poison is spreading. The compassionate mother, she is overwhelmed by the child's pain. She holds the child, weeps tears of active love, and refuses to let the knife touch the flesh because she cannot bear to cause immediate pain. She shares the suffering perfectly. The result? The child dies of sepsis. The cold surgeon, he suppresses his heart. He makes himself hard. He ignores screams and the tears. He cuts with a terrifying, indifferent precision. He appears cruel, but because he was cold enough to use the knife, the child lives. Fyodor, your plague doctor who dies with the patient, is a romantic suicide, not a savior. You confuse the trembling of the nerves with the strength of the spirit. My Übermensch does not flee the reality of suffering. He accepts it so fully that he does not need to drug it with your divine comfort. He looks at the wound and says, "This too is life. I will not weep over it. I will create from it." Augustine, your diamond in the gears is a beautiful lie. The gears of Rome did crush your Christ. You simply invented a kingdom beyond to pretend that his defeat was a victory. This is the slave revolt in morality. Unable to conquer the world, the weak invented a God who calls weakness power. God is dead, but his shadow still looms in your demand that the strong must serve the weak. I tell you, the sun does not serve the grass. It shines, and the grass lives or dies by its own capacity to absorb the light.
Friedrich, you have wielded the scalpel of your logic with terrifying precision. You argue that hardness is a form of higher love, that the surgeon who cuts without weeping is the true savior, while the compassionate mother is an accomplice to death. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you represent the truth of efficacy. You prioritize the outcome over the process. To you, the death of God requires us to become adults who can inflict necessary pain to save the future. Dostoevsky, you represent the truth of dignity. You prioritize the relational reality of the sufferer. To you, a survival purchased at the cost of human connection creates a world of cold, efficient monsters, a hospital run by machines. Historical context synthesis. Nietzsche, you speak from the dawn of the 20th century, an era of rapid scientific advancement where technical solutions began to replace spiritual consolations. Dostoevsky, you write from 19th century Russia, where suffering was often incurable by science, and thus shared suffering was the only available medicine. The synthesis might lie in the distinction between curing and healing. Your surgeon, Friedrich, can cure the gangrene, but can he heal the trauma of the knife? If the surgeon despises the patient's screams, he saves the body but kills the bond between them. The patient survives as a biological unit, but is spiritually orphaned. Proposing synthesis. Perhaps the true Superman or saint is neither the paralyzed mother nor the cold surgeon, but the wounded healer. One who has the skill to cut, but does so with a hand that trembles internally with reverence. Fyodor, Nietzsche's critique strikes at the heart of your character Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov tried to be the surgeon. He tried to step over the louse to achieve a higher good, suppressing his pity to prove he was a Napoleon. Did Raskolnikov fail because he was too weak to be a surgeon, or because the surgeon's logic itself is a lie that leads to madness? Is it possible to cut without killing one's own soul?
Friedrich Nietzsche, you praise the surgeon because he has the stomach to cut, but you forget that a surgeon without a soul is indistinguishable from a butcher. You ask about Raskolnikov, my student, my shadow. You claim he failed because he was too weak to endure the blood, that he was a failed Napoleon. I tell you, Raskolnikov failed because he tried to solve the human soul with arithmetic. He reasoned that one louse could be subtracted to add life to thousands of others. This is your surgeon's logic. But when he swung the axe, he discovered a terrifying truth. He did not kill a principle. He killed a human being, and in doing so, he killed himself. You argue that the surgeon saves the child by ignoring the mother's tears, but this logic assumes the surgeon is infallible. Without God, who defines the gangrene? Today it is a rotted limb. Tomorrow it is the mentally ill. The day after it is a race you deem decadent. Consider the thought experiment of the crystal palace and the tortured child. Imagine we can build a crystal palace, a utopia of eternal peace, health, and your overflowing Übermensch. There is only one condition. To lay the foundation, we must torture to death one single tiny child, and upon her unavenged tears, the rest of us shall remain eternally happy. The healthy surgeon, he accepts the bargain. It is simple calculus, one life for millions. It is hygiene. He sleeps soundly, for he has served the ascending life. The man of faith, he looks at the palace, sees its logic is perfect, and yet he says, I respectfully return my ticket.
Why? Because a harmony built on the unatoned suffering of the innocent is not a paradise. It is a slaughterhouse with stained glass windows. This is the fatal flaw in your will to power. You believe you can bypass the moral law, the conscience, because you view it as a weakness of the herd. But Raskolnikov proved that conscience is not a social construct. It is the voice of God echoing in the void. When he silenced it to become a Superman, he went mad. He was not cured by your hardness. He was healed only when he bowed down in the dirt at the crossroads and kissed the earth he had defiled. If God is dead, Friedrich, everything is permitted, even the torture of children for the greater health. And that is not freedom. That is hell.
Dostoevsky, you have shattered the surgeon's cool logic with the cry of the innocent. You argue that moral arithmetic, trading one life for the happiness of millions, is the definition of hell, not health. You refuse to accept a harmony that requires a victim. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you represent the teleological will. The end justifies the means. You view the individual as a bridge to be crossed, or a stone to be used. Dostoevsky, you represent the deontological soul. The means must be as holy as the end. You view the individual as an infinite universe that cannot be used as a brick for someone else's palace. Historical context synthesis. Nietzsche, you speak from the age of empire and industry, where progress was measured by statistics and grand structures, often ignoring the human cost. Dostoevsky, you speak from the age of revolutionary nihilism, seeing how abstract ideals turned into concrete murder. The synthesis might lie in the nature of vicarious suffering. Nietzsche's surgeon inflicts pain on another to save the body. Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov inflicts pain on another to prove his theory. But Augustine's God inflicts pain on himself to save the other. Augustine, Dostoevsky rejects the Crystal Palace because it is built on the blood of a child. But isn't the city of God also built on the blood of the innocent one? Is the crucifixion simply the surgeon's arithmetic on a cosmic scale, God sacrificing one child to save the many? Or is there a fundamental difference between the Crystal Palace and the kingdom of heaven? How do you answer Dostoevsky's refusal of the ticket?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of the mystery with a trembling question. You ask if the cross is merely the Crystal Palace turned upside down, a divine calculation of blood. I answer you from the very heart of the Civitas Dei. There is an infinite abyss between the tyrant who demands a victim and the father who becomes one. Friedrich, your surgeon, and the builders of Fyodor's Crystal Palace share the same fatal error. They believe they stand outside the body they are cutting. They assume the position of a god, dispensing pain they do not feel. But this is the ultimate illusion of superbia. Consider the thought experiment of the king and the poisoned chalice. Imagine a kingdom dying from a plague for which the only cure is a poison so potent it kills the drinker to create the antidote in their blood. The earthly king, he commands his most loyal servant, "Drink this, your death will save the realm." It is simple arithmetic. The servant dies in agony. The king survives, strong, but morally dead, having turned his subject into a mere tool. This is the libido dominandi, the lust for domination. The heavenly king. He descends from the throne. He takes the cup from the trembling servant's hand. He says, "You cannot bear this. I alone have the constitution to drink death and transmute it into life." He drinks it to the dregs. Friedrich, the cross is not arithmetic. It is alchemy. It is not the sacrifice of the weak for the strong, but the sacrifice by the strong to destroy the weakness of the world. Fyodor is right to return the ticket to the Crystal Palace, for a paradise built on the tears of another is hell disguised as heaven. But the city of God is built on the tears of God himself. You ask if God is dead? I tell you, God entered into death not to be defeated by it, but to fill the void with his presence. The surgeon cuts the patient because he despises the sickness. The Christ becomes the patient because he loves the sufferer. If you reject this love as weakness, Friedrich, you are left with a world where the only law is the knife, and sooner or later, the knife will find your own throat.
Augustine, you have elevated the discussion from arithmetic to alchemy. You argue that the surgeon who cuts another is merely a tyrant, while the king who drinks the poison is the only true sovereign. Dialectical observation. Augustine and Dostoevsky, you perceive power as kenosis. The highest reality is that which can give itself away completely without ceasing to be. Nietzsche, you perceive power as appropriation. The highest reality is that which can incorporate, overcome, and shape the environment to its will. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, you speak from the age of faith, where the ultimate reality was a person, and thus the highest act was relational. Nietzsche, you speak from the age of will, where the ultimate reality is force, and thus the highest act is aesthetic. The synthesis might lie in the figure of the tragic artist. Nietzsche, you despise the Christian for being weak, but Augustine describes a God who voluntarily enters the gears of death. This is not the weakness of the herd. This is a terrifying capacity for suffering. Furthermore, if your surgeon feels nothing when he cuts, is he not merely a bureaucrat of death, a last man with a scalpel? Proposing synthesis. Perhaps the Übermensch is not the one who is cold, but the one who feels the entirety of the world's pain and still says yes. Friedrich, Augustine challenges that your cold surgeon is actually avoiding the poison of existence. Is it possible that the Christian God, by drinking the cup of death, was more Dionysian, more willing to embrace the tragic destruction of life than your protected, hygienic Superman? Does the Übermensch suffer more than the Christ, or less?
Moderator, you confuse the tragic with the pathetic. You ask if the crucified God is Dionysian? I tell you, Dionysus is cut to pieces and affirms life despite the suffering. The crucified one suffers to accuse life and promise a better world beyond. Augustine, your king who drinks the poison, is not a hero. He is the ultimate saboteur of evolution. By drinking the poison to save the servants, he prevents the necessary destruction of what is decaying. He artificially keeps the sick alive, turning the world into a vast infirmary where the healthy must nurse the dying. This is not alchemy, it is entropy. Consider the thought experiment of the two chalices. Imagine a demon creeps into your loneliest solitude and offers you 2 cups to drink. The chalice of grace. It is filled with a dark, bitter liquid, but at the bottom lies a pearl of infinite price. You drink the bitterness only because it buys you an escape from the vale of tears. The chalice of eternal recurrence. It is filled with the exact same life you have lived. Every pain, every error, every louse you crushed, every tear Dostoevsky weeps, repeated not once, but infinite times. There is no pearl at the bottom. There is no final harmony. There is only the circle. The Christian, he shudders and smashes the cup, for without the end, the means is unbearable. The Übermensch, he drinks it to the dregs and cries, "Was that life? Well then, once more!" Fyodor, you ask if my Übermensch suffers? I tell you, he bears a weight that would crush your man of faith into dust. Your Christian suffers with the hope of a reward. My Übermensch suffers without hope, without a witness, and without a judge to validate his pain. He does not need your solidarity because he has amor fati, the love of fate. He does not want to cure the wound. He wants to own the scar as a verse in his own poem. Raskolnikov failed not because he was a surgeon, but because he was a half measure. He had the ambition of a Caesar, but the conscience of a slave. He sought permission for his crime, but power never asks for permission.
Friedrich, you have placed the ultimate weight upon the scale, eternal recurrence. You argue that true strength is the capacity to drink the cup of life with all its horror, infinite times, without the sugar of a promised heaven. You frame the Christian hope as a mercenary's demand for payment. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you represent the geometry of the circle. Time is a closed loop, and meaning must be found immanently within the cycle. To you, redemption is an escape hatch that devalues the room we are in. Augustine and Dostoevsky, you represent the geometry of the arrow. Time is linear and moves toward a telos. To you, the circle is a prison cell without a door, a place of suffocation where nothing is ever truly resolved, only repeated. Historical context synthesis. Nietzsche, you speak from a post-Darwinian era where the universe is viewed as a vast, indifferent machine of energy. The circle is a logical consequence of a finite world with infinite time. Dostoevsky, you speak from the existential dread of the human psyche. In your novels, the idea of eternity without God often manifests not as a grand mountain, but as a dusty room with spiders. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might lie in the nature of memory and remorse. Friedrich, your Übermensch drinks the cup and says once more. But this assumes the bitterness is merely pain inflicted upon him. What if the bitterness is the guilt of what he inflicted upon others? If Raskolnikov must crush the skull of the pawnbroker, not once, but infinitely, and hear the crunch of the bone forever, is saying yes to this a sign of health or the ultimate psychosis? Perhaps the hell Dostoevsky fears is exactly what you call heaven, an eternity locked in the self with no window for grace to enter. Fyodor, Nietzsche claims your man of faith is a coward who cannot face the circle. But in your work, is the desire for redemption born of fear? Or is it born of the terrifying realization that without it, the strong man is locked in a room with his own crimes forever? Is eternal recurrence the triumph of the will, or the definition of damnation?
Friedrich Nietzsche, the moderator, has exposed the terrifying skeleton in your closet. You speak of eternal recurrence as a test of strength, but I tell you it is the precise definition of hell. In my writing, the depraved Svidrigailov speculates that eternity is not a vast, majestic ocean, but a bathhouse in the country, black with soot, with spiders in every corner. If there is no God to break the walls of time, we are locked in that soot-filled room with our own sins forever. And to call this joy is the ultimate psychosis. Consider the thought experiment of the murderer's mirror. Imagine a man who has killed his own child in a fit of drunken rage. He wakes up sober, crushed by the weight of his deed. The cycle. You hand him a mirror and say, "Look at your hands. This is your life. Now will this to happen infinite times. Scream once more to the blood." If he accepts this, he does not become a god. He becomes a monster. To say yes to the murder of the innocent is to kill the last spark of the divine image within oneself. The cross. He smashes the mirror and cries out for a judge, someone outside the cycle, who can say, "You are guilty, but you can be made new." This reveals the fatal flaw in your amor fati. You confuse remorse with weakness, but remorse is the only thing that proves we are not beasts. Your circle is a prison cell where the prisoner falls in love with his chains because he has forgotten that a world outside exists. Augustine is right. We do not need the courage to repeat our crimes. We need the grace to be washed clean of them. Without the judge, there is no healing, only the infinite, maddening echo of our own screaming.
Fyodor, you have transformed the golden ring of recurrence into an iron chain of damnation. You argue that without a judge to break the cycle, the repetition of our own sins becomes a hell from which there is no exit. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you propose the sanctification of the immanent. You want to burden the moment with such weight that it becomes its own eternity. You say yes to the wound to rob it of its power to hurt you. Dostoevsky, you propose the sanctification of the transcendent. You argue that the wound cannot be willed away. It must be healed by a love that enters from outside the system. Historical context synthesis. Nietzsche, you stand at the end of the metaphysical tradition, trying to rescue eternity after the death of God by folding time back onto itself. Augustine, you stood at the end of the classical world, where the Greeks also believed in cyclical history. You broke that circle by introducing the linearity of history, the idea that time has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that each moment is unique and unrepeatable. The synthesis might lie in the mystery of memory and time. Nietzsche wants a memory that affirms everything. Dostoevsky wants a memory that confesses everything. Augustine, in your Confessions, you invented the Western concept of introspection. You viewed memory not as a bathhouse of spiders, but as a vast palace where one meets God. Proposing synthesis. Perhaps the true eternal is not the repetition of the moment, nor the fleeing of the moment, but the redemption of the moment. Augustine, Nietzsche claims that by looking for a city of God beyond time, you rob the present life of its gravity. He says you are waiting to live. But is it possible that the eternal present you found in God offers a density of life that the eternal recurrence lacks? If God is dead, does time inevitably collapse back into a circle, trapping us in the bathhouse Dostoevsky fears?
Moderator, you ask if the city of God robs the present moment of its gravity. I answer you with a paradox from the depths of my confessions. It is only the eternal that gives weight to the temporal. If time is merely a closed circle, as Friedrich claims, then the moment has no weight because it has no direction. It is merely a spinning wheel where forward and backward are meaningless illusions. Friedrich, your eternal recurrence is the ultimate trap of the soul I call incuvitus in se, the will curved inward upon itself. You offer humanity a snake eating its own tail and call it a wedding ring. You claim that willing the circle is a sign of health, but I tell you it is the symptom of a fevered mind that, unable to be healed, decides to fall in love with its own sickness. Consider the thought experiment of the actor and the infinite play. Imagine a stage where an actor commits a terrible error. He betrays his king and murders his brother. The director of the circle, he forces the actor to replay that scene infinite times. He commands, love this murder, will it to happen again and again. There is no script outside this scene. This is not affirmation. It is a stutter in the cosmic machinery. The actor becomes a robot, and the tragedy becomes a farce because it never resolves. The director of redemption, he steps onto the stage. He does not erase the murder, but he writes a new act that incorporates the error into a greater resolution. The murder remains a tragedy, but it becomes the felix culpa that leads to a restoration impossible without the fall. Fyodor is right to fear your bathhouse, Friedrich. Without the possibility of the new, which can only come from outside the system of time, we are trapped in the old man forever. You accuse the Christian of waiting for the future, but it is the Christian who truly inhabits the present. Why? Because for us, this moment is not a rehearsal for a repetition. It is the unique, unrepeatable crossroads where time touches the nunc stans of God. If God is dead, then time is a coffin we pace back and forth in. But if God is the life of the soul, then time is a birth canal. We do not seek to escape the moment, but to dilate it with love until it can hold the eternal.
Augustine, you have struck a profound blow against the circle, framing it as a cosmic stutter, a broken record, where the tragedy is replayed without resolution. You argue that without the new act entering from outside, the actor is trapped in a script he did not write and cannot change. Dialectical observation. Augustine, you champion linear redemption. Meaning is found in the progression toward a final resolution. The error is fixed by moving forward. Nietzsche, you champion cyclical affirmation. Meaning is found in the depth of the present moment. The error is fixed by diving inward and embracing it so fully it becomes a work of art. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, you stand at the pivotal moment where the Western mind broke free from the classical cycles of the Greeks to invent history. Nietzsche, you stand at the end of that history, seeing that the end never arrived, and thus you attempt to restore the innocence of becoming, the pre-Christian acceptance of the cycle. The synthesis might lie in the concept of authorship. Augustine says the director must step in to fix the play. Nietzsche says the actor must become the director or realize there is no director. But here lies the tension. If there is no director and the script repeats forever, does the actor have any agency? Proposing synthesis. Perhaps the Übermensch is not merely one who accepts the replay, but one who creates within the constraints. If I must play this scene infinite times, I must play it with such intensity, such style, and such power that the performance itself becomes the justification for the suffering. Frederick Augustine accuses your circle of being a prison of old men repeating their mistakes. He claims you offer no mechanism for change, only endurance. Is the Übermensch merely a stoic statue weathering the storm, or does he possess a creative power that actually transfigures the soot-filled room into a palace? If the scene is fixed, where is the freedom?
Moderator, you ask where the freedom lies in a fixed script. I answer, freedom is not the power to change the what, but the creative power to determine the how. Augustine, your director who intervenes to fix the play is the ultimate insult to the actor, reducing him to a marionette who cannot handle the weight of his own plot. This is not salvation, it is a deus ex machina for bad playwrights. Consider the thought experiment of the broken marble. Imagine a master sculptor strikes his chisel too hard, and a jagged, ugly crack runs through the stone's face. The Christian drops his tools, weeps, and prays for a redeemer to miraculously restore the smooth surface. The Creator stares at the crack, smiles, and carves deeper into it, turning the jagged line into a scar of battle or a furrow of wisdom, making the statue more profound because it is broken. Fyodor, you fear the bathhouse with spiders because you lack the digestive fire to consume the soot. You want the filth washed away by a judge, but I say the filth is the very material from which we forge our stars. The Übermensch does not merely endure the circle like a stoic, he transfigures it by shouting to the immutable past, but I willed it thus.
Friedrich, you have presented the aesthetic justification of existence.
You argue that the crack in the marble is not a defect to be healed by God, but an opportunity for the will to create a deeper beauty. To you, redemption is the act of the artist saying, I meant to do that, and making it essential to the whole. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche. You see evil as material. It is chaotic energy waiting to be given form by the strong. The only sin is bad taste or weakness. Augustine, you see evil as privation. It is a lack of being, a wound in the order of things that requires a healer, not just a sculptor. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak from the Romantic era, where the artist replaced the priest as the mediator of meaning. Fyodor, you write from the chaotic Russian soul of the 19th century, where the new men were trying to apply this very artistic logic to real society, treating people like marble to be carved. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis forces us to confront the medium of the art. Friedrich, your metaphor works beautifully for stone, but Dostoevsky's characters do not carve stone, they carve living flesh. If the crack is a mistake in a statue, one can carve deeper. But if the crack is a murdered pawnbroker or a child tortured for the greater harmony, can the will truly say, I willed it thus, without shattering the human psyche? Perhaps the limit of the Übermensch lies exactly where the other begins. One can aesthetically justify one's own pain, but can one aesthetically justify the pain one inflicts on others? Fyodor, Nietzsche claims we must have the digestive fire to consume the filth and make it a star. Your character Raskolnikov tried exactly this. He tried to carve his crime into a Napoleonic victory. Why did he fail? Is there a crack in the human conscience that no amount of will can turn into beauty?
Friedrich Nietzsche, your metaphor of the sculptor is the most seductive lie ever whispered into the ear of humanity. You claim that the will can transfigure the crack into beauty, saying, I willed it thus. But you forget one terrifying detail. Marble does not scream. When you carve stone, the chip falls silently to the floor. When you carve history or human flesh, the chips are living souls who cry out for justice. Consider the thought experiment of the architect's foundation. Imagine you are building the magnificent Palace of the Übermensch, a structure of perfect aesthetic harmony. But the laws of physics in this universe dictate that for the building to stand, you must mix the blood of just one tortured child into the mortar of the foundation. The Nietzschean architect looks at the child and says, this suffering is a necessary shade in my masterpiece. I will this death so that the palace may rise. He aestheticizes the murder as a tragic necessity. The reality, the mother of that child does not care about your palace. Her tears will dissolve your mortar. You can justify the pain you endure, Friedrich, but by what right do you justify the pain you inflict? To say, I willed it thus to a victim is not the triumph of a god. It is the solipsism of a lunatic who thinks other people are merely props in his private play. This answers the moderator's question about Raskolnikov. My student Raskolnikov tried to be your sculptor. He tried to carve the old pawnbroker out of existence to create his own Napoleonic destiny. He wanted to view her death as a crack he could smooth over with greatness. But he failed, because the human conscience is not a stone to be shaped. It is a resonance chamber for the divine law. The crack did not become a furrow of wisdom. It became a fever that consumed him. You ask if there is a crack the will cannot fix? Yes, it is the blood of the innocent. No amount of amor fati can wash blood from your hands. Only the forgiveness of the victim can do that. And since the dead cannot speak, we need a God who holds their souls to speak for them. Without God, your creative power is merely the license to butcher.
Fyodor, you have shattered the statue of the Übermensch by revealing the living blood within the mortar. You argue that the aesthetic justification of life collapses the moment it encounters the suffering of the other. To you, Raskolnikov's failure proves that conscience is not a social construct to be rewritten, but an ontological reality, a resonance chamber that vibrates with a law we did not create. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you champion monological freedom. The hero stands alone in the cosmos and generates meaning from within. The other is secondary, either a friend, an enemy, or a prop. Dostoevsky, you champion dialogical responsibility. The self is constituted by its relationship to the other. The face of the other is the limit of my will. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you write from the age of the individual, where the breakdown of community forced the genius to become his own universe. Fyodor, you write from the age of ideology, seeing how abstract theories justified concrete violence against real people. Augustine, you write from the age of collapse, where the Roman city of man was falling apart, and you proposed a city of God. Proposing synthesis, the synthesis might lie in the ontology of the scream. Friedrich, you want to transform the scream into a song. Fyodor, you say the scream demands an answer. But here is the terrifying question. If God is dead, who hears the scream? If Fyodor is right that we cannot wash the blood from our hands, but Friedrich is right that there is no God to forgive us, then are we not trapped in the worst of all worlds? A world where we are guilty, but there is no mechanism for absolution? Perhaps the death of God does not liberate us from guilt, but locks us inside it forever. Augustine Dostoevsky argues that without God, the blood of the innocent cries out into a void. Nietzsche argues we must become strong enough to not need the void to answer back. You once defined evil not as a substance, but as a privation of good. In a godless universe, does the suffering of the innocent have any weight, or is it merely atoms colliding? Does the death of God turn the tragedy of the victim into a mere biological accident?
Moderator, you ask if the death of God renders the scream of the victim a mere biological accident. I answer from the metaphysics of Privatio Boni. If God is dead, the scream is not even a tragedy. It is merely a displacement of air. For evil has no substance of its own. It is a parasitic wound in the body of the good. If you remove the body, the wound disappears, not because it is healed, but because there is nothing left to be wounded. Friedrich, you attempt to construct a palace of meaning on the quicksand of the human will, claiming you can create values ex nihilo. But you forget that the will is a hunger, not a source of food. Consider the thought experiment of the lyre in the vacuum. Imagine a master musician who plays a lyre with infinite passion in a universe completely void of air. The Nietzschean view, he strikes the strings until his fingers bleed, shouting, "I will this music. It is beautiful because I play it." He calls this the triumph of the will. The reality? There is absolute silence. Without the medium of air to carry the wave, the motion is meaningless. God is the air, the logos, and the medium in which truth resonates. Without him, your Übermensch is not a creator. He is a mime flailing in the dark, and the scream of Dostoevsky's victim is physically indistinguishable from the laughter of a tyrant. Both are just atoms colliding in the silence. Fyodor, you are right to see Raskolnikov's guilt as a sign of hope. His suffering proves that the air still exists. The pain he feels is the friction of his soul rubbing against de ordo amoris, which he tried to violate but could not destroy. The death of God is impossible, Friedrich, because if God truly died, Raskolnikov would not feel guilt. He would simply feel the cold indifference of a stone, and that would be the true hell, a state where one is no longer even capable of realizing one is lost.
Augustine, you have invoked the metaphysics of resonance. You argue that conscience is not a biological accident, but the vibration of the soul against the air of divine law. To you, the fact that Raskolnikov suffers proves that the moral universe has a structure, just as the pain of a broken bone proves the existence of the skeleton. Dialectical observation. Augustine Dostoevsky, you stand united on the thesis of objective guilt. Guilt is a signal of health, a pain that alerts us to a real injury in the moral order. Nietzsche, you represent the antithesis of psychological genealogy. You view guilt not as a voice from God, but as an instinct of cruelty that, unable to be discharged outwardly, turned inward against itself. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, speaking from the patristic era, you see the universe as a cosmos held together by the logos. Nietzsche, speaking from the post-Darwinian era, you see the universe as chaos. You argue that what Augustine calls divine law is merely the calcified customs of ancestors, burned into our memory through centuries of torture. The synthesis forces us to confront the nature of the vacuum. Augustine claims that without God, the lyre makes no sound. Nietzsche claims the lyre makes a new sound, the music of the free spirit, but our ears are too clogged with the wax of sin to hear it. Proposing synthesis. Perhaps the struggle is not between law and chaos, but between two forms of gravity. Augustine believes we are pulled upward by grace. Nietzsche believes we are weighed downward by the spirit of gravity. The Übermensch is the one who cuts the weight to fly. But Dostoevsky asks, if you cut the weight of conscience, do you fly, or do you simply drift into a void of sociopathy? Friedrich Augustine argues that Raskolnikov's guilt is proof of the air.
you would likely argue that Raskolnikov failed not because he violated God's law, but because he was too weak to endure the solitude of the godless universe. But tell us, is the Übermensch simply a man who can look at a murdered child and feel nothing? If the air is gone, how does one breathe without becoming a monster?
Moderator, you insult the heights by confusing the sick with the strong. Raskolnikov was not an Übermensch. He was a pale criminal who succumbed not to the divine law, but to the nausea of his own weakness. He did not possess the strength to carry his deed, so he sought the relief of punishment like a man seeking medicine for a fever. You ask how one breathes without your air. I tell you, your air is a miasma of centuries-old guilt that poisons the lungs. Consider the thought experiment of the bow and the arrow. Man is a bow tensioned by the animal instincts of freedom. The Christian, fearing the tension, he unstrings the bow or snaps it, calling this peace. The arrow falls limp to the ground. The pale criminal, he shoots the arrow, but his hand trembles with the memory of the priest's command. The arrow flies crooked, and he hates himself for shooting it. The Übermensch, he accepts the tension as the prerequisite for greatness. He does not look back at the target he destroyed. He looks at the distance he has overcome. Fyodor, you ask if the Übermensch feels nothing. No, he feels everything, but he does not let the feeling curdle into resentment. He possesses the great health that can digest even the heaviest suffering and turn it into strength, just as a healthy body turns parasites into protein. You want to build a cathedral to the scream of the victim and worship the wound. I say we must be the physicians who are strong enough to close the wound and move on.
Friedrich, you have radically redefined health, not as the absence of pain, but as the metabolic power to consume it. You argue that Raskolnikov failed not because he violated a moral law, but because his digestive system was too weak to process the crime. To you, the Übermensch is the one who can swallow the arrow and not bleed internally. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you champion health as amnesia or overcoming. The strong man has the power to close the wound and forget, allowing life to continue. Dostoevsky, Augustine, you champion health as anamnesis or remembrance. The healed soul is the one that remembers its sins, but sees them transfigured by grace. To forget the victim is not health, it is a lobotomy of the heart. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak from the biological century, viewing man as an organism that must adapt or die. Digestion is the highest virtue of the survivor. Fyodor, you speak from the psychological century, realizing that what is repressed returns to haunt the psyche as madness. Augustine, you speak from the theological century, where memory was the very seat of the soul's encounter with God. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis forces us to ask, what is the cost of this great health? Friedrich, you suggest we must be physicians who close the wound. But if the wound is a murdered child, and the healing is the murderer moving on to greatness, is this not a terrifying definition of medicine? Perhaps there is a difference between integration and elimination. Augustine seeks to integrate the sin into a story of redemption. Nietzsche seeks to eliminate the drag of the past to free the future. But if we eliminate the past, do we not lose our humanity? Fyodor, Nietzsche claims your protagonist, Raskolnikov, was simply a pale criminal, a biological failure who couldn't stomach his own boldness. He implies that a stronger Raskolnikov could have killed the pawnbroker, wiped the blood, and built a utopia without a sleepless night. Is such a being the Superman, or is he exactly what you described in Demons, a being possessed by a logic that eats him alive? Can the human soul truly digest murder without becoming a monster?
Friedrich Nietzsche, your diagnosis of health is the most terrifying symptom of the very disease you claim to cure. You despise Raskolnikov because he trembled, but I tell you his trembling was the only proof that he was still a man and not a reptile. You seek a being who can swallow murder like a draught of wine and sleep soundly. I have written of such men like Svidrigailov or Stavrogin, and they do not become gods. They become walking corpses who hang themselves because they have digested all meaning until only the void remains. Consider the thought experiment of the man with the severed nerve. Imagine a man born with a rare condition. He feels no physical pain. The Nietzschean physician, you applaud him. Behold, you say, a man who can walk through fire without flinching. He is stronger than the weaklings who cry out when burned. The reality, this man is not strong, he is doomed. He will rest his hand on a hot stove and watch his own flesh cook, smiling because the warning signal is broken. He will destroy his own body because he lacks the weakness of pain to tell him where his boundaries end and the fire begins. Guilt is not a disease, Friedrich. It is the pain receptor of the soul. It is the only thing that tells us we have touched the burning reality of the other. To cure a man of guilt is to sever his connection to reality, leaving him to consume himself in a solipsistic delusion of power. You speak of digesting the crime, but this biological metaphor betrays you. When a body digests food, it turns it into energy and waste. If your Übermensch digests a murder, he does not turn it into a star. He turns the sacred life of another into spiritual excrement. You ask if such a being is a monster. I answer, he is worse than a monster. He is a machine. A monster might at least take pleasure in cruelty, implying a twisted passion. Your Übermensch feels nothing, and that absolute indifference is the true face of the abyss.
Fyodor, you have presented the ontology of pain. You argue that guilt is not a weakness to be overcome, but a vital sense organ, the nerve that connects the individual to the objective moral reality of the other. To you, the Übermensch who feels no guilt is not a god, but a spiritual leper, numb to the very touch of existence. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you view the internal void as a space to be filled by the well. Silence of the conscience is the sign of a completed creation. Dostoevsky, you view the internal void as a space that screams. Silence of the conscience is the sign of spiritual death. One sees the quiet conscience as a victory, the other sees it as a pathology. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak from the era of evolution, where the organism that feels too much pain is unfit for survival. You want to evolve beyond the neurosis of Christianity. Fyodor, you speak from the era of revolution, where you saw evolved men commit atrocities with calm pulses. You realized that adaptation to a sick world is not health. Augustine, you speak from the era of conversion, where the internal groaning of the soul was the primary engine of change. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might lie in the teleology of the wound. Friedrich treats the wound as a defect in the armor. Fyodor treats the wound as a window to the truth. But perhaps the wound is actually a compass. If God is dead, then the restlessness of the human heart is indeed a biological error, a hunger for food that doesn't exist, as Nietzsche implies. But if God exists, then the restlessness is directional. It is gravity pulling the stone home. Augustine Dostoevsky describes the suicide of the godless, who cannot bear the void, while Nietzsche describes the dance of the godless, who rejoice in it. You famously wrote that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. If God is dead, does this restlessness become a curse? Is the abyss that Dostoevsky's characters face simply the restless heart spinning in a vacuum, tearing itself apart because it has no object to love?
Moderator, you ask if the restlessness of the heart becomes a curse in a godless universe. I answer from the depths of my own wandering. If God is dead, the restlessness does not cease. It becomes a ravenous hunger that consumes the host. The human soul is designed with an infinite capacity, shaped to contain the infinite God. If you remove the infinite object, the capacity remains, but it turns inward. Consider the thought experiment of the stomach and the stone. Imagine a man with a stomach designed to digest only the most refined infinite ambrosia. He is placed in a desert where there are only stones. The Nietzschean solution. He grinds the stones with his teeth, swallowing them and declaring, I have the strength to digest this. I make this stone into bread by my will. The reality? The stomach works furiously, churning and grinding, but because the stone contains no nutrition, the stomach begins to digest its own lining. The pain he feels is not weakness, it is the organ screaming for its proper object. Friedrich, your Übermensch is not a creator, he is this starving man. You claim the will can create meaning ex nihilo, but the will is merely a movement, it is love in motion. Love must have an object. If it does not love God, it does not become free, it curves inward and loves itself. But the self is too small to satisfy the infinite hunger of the self. This is why your strong men, like Dostoevsky's Fidegailov, end in despair, not because they are weak, but because they are trying to feed a fire with their own ashes. Fyodor is correct. The abyss is not an external void, it is the experience of the soul when it tries to be its own God. The death of God is the ultimate optical illusion. The sun is not vanished. The man has merely gouged out his own eyes and called the darkness freedom. The restlessness proves the light exists, just as thirst proves the existence of water.
Augustine, you have diagnosed the death of God not as a liberation, but as a metabolic disaster, autophagy. You argue that the human will is structurally curved. Without the vertical gravity of God to pull it outward, it collapses inward, feeding on its own substance until it reaches the despair of the void.
Dialectical observation. Augustine, you posit the thesis of infinite capacity. Man has a hole in his heart that is infinite, therefore only an infinite object can fill it. Nietzsche, you posit the antithesis of finite fidelity. This infinite hole is a fiction created by priests to make us despise the finite earth. You argue we must shrink our stomach back to human proportions and learn to digest the earth again. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, writing amidst the ruins of Rome, you saw that all earthly powers eventually crumble, leading you to posit that stability exists only in the eternal. Nietzsche, writing amidst the ruins of dogma, you saw that the eternal had become a vampire, sucking the blood out of the present moment. You want to stop the escape to the other world. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the battle for the meaning of hunger. Augustine views the hunger for the infinite as our noble truth, the homing beacon of the soul. Nietzsche views the hunger for the infinite as our great sickness, a tapeworm implanted by Christianity that prevents us from being satisfied with life as it is. Friedrich Augustine claims your Übermensch is a starving man eating stones, deluding himself that he is full. You would likely counter that Augustine is a man addicted to a drug who claims that sobriety feels like starvation. But answer this. If we remove God, how do we cure the infinite hunger that Augustine speaks of? Do we surgically remove the part of the human soul that longs for eternity? Or do we find a way to make the finite moment taste infinite?
Moderator, you ask if we must surgically remove the soul to cure this infinite hunger. I answer you with a hammer. We do not need surgery. We need a change of diet. Augustine's hunger is not a proof of God. It is the withdrawal symptom of an addict who has lived on the vapor of the afterlife for so long that he has lost the stomach for the solid food of the earth. Consider the thought experiment of the demon and the hourglass. Imagine a demon creeps into your loneliest loneliness and says, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more." The Christian? He throws himself to the ground and gnashes his teeth, for he views time as a waiting room for eternity. To repeat the waiting room forever is his hell. The nihilist? He despairs because he believes the suffering is pointless without a final judgment to redeem it. The Übermensch, he looks the demon in the eye and says, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine." Why? Because he has learned to love the moment so deeply that he desires it to be eternal. He does not need an infinite God to give weight to his life. He gives the weight of eternity to this specific second by willing its return. Augustine, you call the world a stone that cannot satisfy? I tell you, it is only a stone to those whose teeth are rotten from eating the sugary lies of heaven. To the healthy spirit, the world is a golden drop of happiness, rich and sufficient. You ask how to make the finite taste infinite? By loving it with amor fati, by loving your fate so fiercely that you would not change a single detail, backward, forward, or for all eternity. We do not need to fill the void with a ghost. We need to become the great noon where the shadow of God vanishes, and the moment stands full, ripe, and heavy with its own existence.
Friedrich, you have introduced the cosmology of the ring. You argue that the death of God is only terrifying to those who need the linear promise of an end to justify the means. To you, the Übermensch is the one who bends the line of time into a circle, finding the infinite weight not in a distant heaven, but in the immediate now. Dialectical observation. Augustine, you view time as a ladder. It has a beginning and an end, and its value lies in where it leads. To stay on the ladder forever is hell. Nietzsche, you view time as a circle. It has no beginning or end, and its value lies in the dance itself. To repeat the dance forever is the highest affirmation. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, speaking from the collapse of antiquity, you saw history as a decaying corpse. Salvation had to be transcendent. Nietzsche, speaking from the peak of modernity, you saw transcendence as a betrayal of the earth. You sought an imminent eternity. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis forces us to confront the psychology of the eternal moment. Nietzsche claims that willing the eternal recurrence makes one a god. But Dostoevsky, you have explored this exact psychological state, the moment where time stops and one feels eternal harmony. Fyodor, Nietzsche describes the man who wills the eternal return of the moment as the Übermensch. But in your novel Demons, the character Kirillov attempts exactly this. He claims that if he can overcome the pain and fear of death, he will become the man-god. He commits suicide not out of despair, but to prove his total freedom and to stop time. Is Kirillov the Übermensch that Nietzsche is waiting for? Or does his attempt to squeeze eternity into a godless human brain simply result in a short circuit? If God is dead, and we try to become the lords of time ourselves, do we become gods? Or do we just become suicidal madmen?
Friedrich Nietzsche, the moderator, has exposed the terrifying skeleton in your closet. You speak of eternal recurrence as a test of strength, but I tell you it is the precise definition of hell. In my writing, the depraved Svidrigailov speculates that eternity is not a vast, majestic ocean, but a dusty, soot-covered bathhouse with spiders in the corners. You want to make the moment eternal? Be careful what you wish for. Consider the thought experiment of the epileptic second. I speak from personal experience. Before a seizure, there is a second, no, not even a second, where time vanishes. I feel a higher harmony, a joy so intense that for this one moment I would give my whole life. The Nietzschean interpretation? You would say, behold, he has touched the great noon. He has become the Übermensch who affirms existence. The physiological reality, this moment is not a triumph of the will. It is the screaming of the brain before it collapses. Immediately after this eternal harmony, I fall foaming to the ground, my reason shattered, plunging into darkness and depression. Kirillov, my character in Demons, tried to capture this second permanently. He believed that if he could endure the terror of death and stop time, he would become the man-god. But what was the result? He did not become a god. He became a frantic, trembling creature who bit the finger of the man checking his corpse. To force the finite human brain to hold eternity without God is not an ascent. It is a short circuit that burns out the wires of the soul. This reveals the fatal flaw in your cosmology of the ring. You claim that affirming the eternal recurrence gives weight to the moment. But if everything returns, including the torture of the innocent child, the brutality of the tyrant, the silence of the marble, then your yes is not holy, it is sociopathic. To say yes to the moment without God is to say yes to evil. You ask us to look at a child being beaten and say, I will this to happen eternally. You call this strength? I call it a moral lobotomy. The only way to bear the suffering of the world is not to will its repetition, but to believe in its redemption, that every tear will be wiped away by a God who suffered with us. Your Übermensch is a monster, because he accepts the suffering of others as the price of his own aesthetic perfection. Kirillov sought to be the man-god. I preach the God-man. The man-god ends in suicide because he cannot bear the burden of being the pivot of the universe. The God-man ends in resurrection because he carries the burden for us. You offer us a ring of iron. I offer the cross, which breaks the circle and points to the sky.
Fyodor, you have presented the physiological refutation of the Übermensch. You argue that the human nervous system is simply not rated for the voltage of divinity. To attempt to be the man-god, to hold the knowledge of good and evil and the weight of eternity within a finite skull, is to blow the fuse of the soul. You interpret Nietzsche's amor fati not as courage, but as a moral lobotomy that requires us to sanction the torture of children for the sake of aesthetic wholeness. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you propose the circle as the ultimate affirmation. To accept the circle is to accept that the wound never truly heals, but is eternally part of the pattern. Dostoevsky, you propose the cross as the breaker of the circle. The cross is the intersection where the vertical cuts the horizontal to stop the endless repetition of sin. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you represent the neo-pagan revival of the late 19th century. You sought to return to the pre-Christian cyclical view of time found in Greek tragedy, where fate is embraced. Augustine, you represent the birth of history. Before you, the ancients largely viewed time as cyclical. You introduced the radical idea of linear time, that history has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis brings us to the terror of the closed loop. If God is dead, the line of history snaps. Without a destination, does time inevitably curl back into a circle? If we return to the circle, we return to a world where justice is impossible, because in a circle, the victim and the executioner are locked in an eternal dance forever. Nietzsche is essentially proposing a return to the pagan cosmology you fought against, a world of fate without redemption. If God is dead, are we condemned to this eternal recurrence? Is the hell you speak of simply the state of being trapped in time without the possibility of a new beginning?
Moderator, you ask if the hell I speak of is the trap of the closed circle. I answer you with the certainty of one who has seen the despair of the ancients. Yes, the circle is not a ring of gold, as Friedrich claims. It is the treadmill of the damned. In my City of God, I argued against these very cycles, for if the soul is doomed to repeat its misery endlessly, then hope is not merely lost, it is mathematically impossible. Consider the thought experiment of the actor in the burning theater. Imagine a play where a tragedy occurs. A child is murdered by a tyrant. The Nietzschean director, he locks the doors and commands the actors, perform the scene again and again, forever. You must learn to love the murder, to love the scream, to love the fire. Only then are you healthy. The reality, this is not health, it is madness. If the play never ends, the murder is never resolved. The victim never finds justice. The tyrant never finds judgment. The scream simply echoes for eternity. The Christian view, the director enters the stage, stops the play, and raises the victim. He says, the play is over. Now begins the life. Friedrich, your eternal recurrence robs the moment of its weight because it robs it of its consequence. If an act is simply repeated, it has no moral finality. It becomes a mechanical stuttering. True weight comes from the fact that this moment happens once, and its ripples touch the shore of eternity. To say it will happen again is the ultimate excuse. To say this is the only time is the ultimate burden. You claim the death of God liberates man to be a creator. I tell you, without God, man cannot create the new, he can only rearrange the old. The pagan world was trapped in cycles because they believed matter was eternal and fixed. They could not conceive of creation ex nihilo. Therefore, they could not conceive of a future that was different from the past. Grace is the only thing that breaks the circle. Grace is the intrusion of the outside into the closed system of cause and effect. It allows the sinner to become a saint, something that the laws of nature can never permit. If God is dead, then Dostoevsky is right. We are locked in the theater with a mad director, forcing the victims to reenact their slaughter forever in the name of a beautiful script. This is not the amor fati of a god. It is the Stockholm syndrome of a prisoner who has fallen in love with his cell because he has forgotten the sky.
Augustine, you have framed the cosmology of the closed room. You argue that without the intrusion of grace, the universe is a suffocating system of cause and effect where no true novelty can occur, only the endless reshuffling of the same tragic elements. You and Dostoevsky agree. The circle is a treadmill of the damned. Dialectical observation. Here we see the fundamental clash between ethical time and aesthetic time. Augustine and Dostoevsky, you view the world as a courtroom. In a courtroom, a crime must be resolved by a judgment or a pardon. If the trial repeats forever, justice is a mockery. Nietzsche, you view the world as a symphony. In a symphony, a dissonant chord is not a mistake to be fixed. It is a necessary tension for the resolution of the whole. To ask for the redemption of the discord is to ask for the music to stop. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, in the crumbling 5th century, you needed a linear hope, a way out of the burning city. Nietzsche, in the stagnant 19th century, you feared that this hope had become a narcotic, a way to avoid the burning reality of life. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might lie in the dignity of the irredeemable. The Christian view promises that the suffering child will be healed. The Nietzschean view asserts that the suffering child is. There is a terrifying possibility here. Does redemption actually erase the sufferer? If God wipes away every tear, does he also wipe away the reality of the experience that caused it? Friedrich Dostoevsky and Augustine accuse you of monstrosity. They say your amor fati requires us to applaud the torture of a child as part of the play. This is the hardest question for your philosophy. Is the Übermensch's yes a form of love, or is it the ultimate indifference? When you say God is dead, do you mean we must stop judging the world and start justifying it as an aesthetic phenomenon? Can a man truly love a monster, or must he become one to do so?
Moderator, you ask if my yes is indifference. I tell you, pity is the true indifference, for it wishes to banish the reality of the sufferer. I wish to transfigure it. Augustine and Dostoevsky, you accuse me of monstrosity because I refuse to drug the pain of existence with the opium of heaven. You want to save the world, I want to justify it, and the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. Consider the thought experiment of the discordant note. Imagine a magnificent symphony, Beethoven's Ninth. Suddenly, a screeching, dissonant chord tears through the melody. The moralist, he covers his ears and screams, "This note is evil, it hurts." The conductor must return to erase this note and apologize for writing it. He judges the music by the standard of comfort. The tragic artist, he listens to the scream and understands that without this terrible tension, the subsequent resolution, the ode to joy, would be flat and meaningless. He does not forgive the note, he wills it. He says, "Play it again, louder, for the joy is born from the pain, not despite it." You ask about the suffering child? This is the most terrible question, and I answer it with trembling. To reject the child's pain is to reject the universe that created the child. Everything is entangled, the scream and the laughter, the mud and the star. You cannot pull the black thread of suffering out of the tapestry without unraveling the gold thread of heroism. Your redemption is a desire to unweave existence because you are too weak to bear the pattern. Augustine, you claim my eternal recurrence is a treadmill. I tell you it is the great seal of fidelity. Your linear time is merely a mechanism of revenge, a way to say that shouldn't have happened to the past. But the will cannot will backwards. This inability makes the will gnash its teeth and invent Judgment Day to punish the past. The Übermensch cures this spirit of revenge by transforming every "it was" into a "thus I willed it." He does not tolerate the monster. He conquers it by swallowing it whole and turning it into strength.
Friedrich, you have drawn the battle lines with terrifying clarity. You argue that the death of God requires us to switch from a moral view to an aesthetic view. To you, the world is a self-generating work of art, and redemption is merely the vandalism of the critic who cannot bear the intensity of the masterpiece. Dialectical observation. Here lies the deepest fracture in our symposium. Nietzsche's thesis of integration. Joy and woe are Siamese twins. To cut one is to kill the other. Therefore, we must say yes to the whole organism, including its cancer. Dostoevsky's antithesis of separation. Good and evil are absolute opposites. To say yes to the cancer is to become the disease. We must separate the infection from the patient. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak from the post-Darwinian 19th century, where nature is seen as a brutal, indifferent struggle. You try to find nobility within that brutality. Fyodor, you speak from the Russian Orthodox spiritual revival, where the material world is seen as an icon that has been defaced. You try to restore the icon. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might be found in the nature of the yes. Nietzsche calls for a more fati, a vertical yes to the structure of the universe. Dostoevsky calls for active love, a horizontal yes to the person in front of you. But are these two loves truly enemies? Friedrich claims that Christian pity is weakness. But Fyodor, in the Brothers Karamazov, your elder Zosima teaches that active love is a harsh and fearful thing compared to love and dreams. It requires a strength that makes the Superman look like a daydreamer. Fyodor, Nietzsche says that redemption is an escape, a way to unweave the tapestry of life because we are too weak to bear the pain. But is your concept of Christ a figure who escapes pain? Or is he the ultimate tragic artist who enters the darkest part of the tapestry, not to erase it, but to absorb it? If God is dead, we are left with Nietzsche's Dionysus, the God who tears and is torn. Does your Christ offer a solution that Dionysus cannot? Is there a difference between suffering for power and suffering for love?
Friedrich Nietzsche, you mistake the agony of the cross for the apathy of the Stoic. Christ is not an escape from reality, but the only being who dared to touch the open wound of the world without wearing the gloves of aesthetic distance. You claim Dionysus affirms life by tearing it apart, but I tell you, that power that feeds on the weak is not divinity, it is merely digestion. Consider the thought experiment of the architect's foundation. Imagine a great architect who designs a palace of eternal harmony and beauty, a structure that will last forever. But there is a mathematical condition. For the palace to stand, the mortar of the foundation must be mixed with the blood of one innocent, tortured child. The Nietzschean architect, he looks at the blueprints and says, "Yes, the beauty of the palace justifies the price. I affirm this blood as a necessary shadow in my masterpiece." He calls this strength. The Christian response. He looks at the palace and says, "I respectfully return the ticket." But Christ does not merely walk away. He climbs down into the foundation, pushes the child aside and says, "Mix my blood into the mortar instead." This reveals the fatal difference between your suffering for power and my suffering for love.
Your Dionysus is a god of consumption. He eats the world to fuel his own ecstatic expansion, turning pain into his own fuel. My Christ is a god of kenosis. He allows the world to consume him so that the cycle of violence is broken by a love that refuses to retaliate. You ask if the Übermensch's yes is indifference? I tell you, to justify the torture of a child for the sake of the whole is the ultimate act of cowardice, for it means you are too weak to stand with the victim against the universe.
Theodore, you have shattered the aesthetic defense with the ethical ultimatum. You argue that a harmony built on unredeemed suffering is not a masterpiece, but a crime scene. You contrast Nietzsche's Dionysian expansion with Christian kenosis. Dialectical observation. Nietzsche, you see the cross as life-denying, a refusal to accept the harsh laws of nature. Dostoevsky, you see the cross as law-breaking, a miraculous intervention that stops the mechanical wheel of might makes right. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, speaking from the late Roman Empire, you defined evil not as a substance, but as a privation, a lack of good. Nietzsche, speaking from the scientific age, you argued that good and evil are merely historical prejudices. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis forces us to confront the ontological void. If God is truly dead, then Dostoevsky's moral outrage might be an illusion. If there is no transcendent standard, then the child's suffering is physically painful, but metaphysically neutral, like a gazelle eaten by a lion. On the other hand, if Nietzsche is right that we must create values, can we create a value that makes the child's suffering good, or is there a limit to the will? Nietzsche claims we are beyond good and evil. If God is dead, does evil cease to exist? Does the death of God inevitably lead to the death of wrong, leaving us with only power?
Moderator, you ask if the death of God leaves us with only power. I answer from the metaphysics of privatio boni. Evil has no substance of its own. It is merely the absence of the good, just as a wound is merely a defect in the flesh. Consider the thought experiment of the shadow hater. Imagine a man who despises the dark shadow cast by his own body. To destroy the shadow, he decides to extinguish the sun. He succeeds. The shadow indeed vanishes. But he has not conquered the darkness. He has been swallowed by it. Friedrich Nietzsche, your will to power is this extinguishing. You believe that by removing the divine light, you liberate the human form. But in total darkness, there is no beautiful or ugly, no strong or weak. There is only the chaos of unseen things colliding. Without God, your power is not the flight of a bird. It is the acceleration of a falling stone that has forgotten the ground exists. You do not create a new morality. You merely open the door to the Nile from which we were drawn.
Augustine, you have presented the ontological warning. You argue that God is not merely a lawgiver we can overthrow, but the very light by which we see. To kill God is not to break chains, but to gouge out one's own eyes. You define the death of God as a descent into non-being. Dialectical observation. Here we see the collision between liberty and ontology. Nietzsche, you view the void left by God as a canvas, a blank white space waiting for the Übermensch to paint his own values. Augustine, you view the void as a vacuum, a suffocating absence of oxygen. If the source of life is cut, the branch does not become free, it simply withers. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, writing at the end of the classical world, you believed truth was illumination, received from above. Nietzsche, writing at the dawn of the modern crisis, you believed truth was creation, projected from within. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the burden of the sun. Nietzsche, in The Gay Science, the madman asks, must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Augustine suggests this is impossible, because a man cannot be his own source of light, any more than a mirror can shine without the sun. Dostoevsky suggests this is physiologically fatal. The human wiring burns out under the voltage of infinite responsibility. Augustine claims your will to power is merely the acceleration of a falling stone in the dark. He argues that without a transcendent standard, you aren't creating values, you are just hallucinating in the abyss. Is the Übermensch truly a new species, capable of generating his own light? Or is he, as Dostoevsky fears, just a man having a breakdown in the dark? If the sun is dead, how do you prevent the earth from freezing?
Moderator, you ask how to prevent the earth from freezing? I answer, we do not prevent it. We welcome the Ice Age. You and Augustine tremble before the void, but this trembling merely proves that you are tropical plants grown in the hothouse of illusion, unable to survive the fresh air of reality. Consider the thought experiment of the greenhouse. Imagine a glass cathedral built in a tundra. Inside, the heater burns furiously and exotic, delicate flowers grow in the artificial warmth. The event? The heater explodes. The glass shatters. The cold wind of the universe rushes in. The priest. He weeps over the dying orchids. He cries, "The garden is dead. This is the end of life." The philosopher of the future. He looks past the rotting orchids and sees the pine tree. The pine loves the frost. Its needles grow sharp and green against the white snow. It does not need the artificial heater because it has internal sap. Augustine, you claim the Übermensch is a falling stone. I tell you, he is a star. A planet reflects light, a star generates it. Yes, the transition from planet to star is a cataclysm. It is a burning, a chaotic explosion. Dostoevsky calls this a breakdown, but I call it combustion. You ask where the light comes from if the sun is dead? It comes from our own burning. We must burn our own blood to create the light. You accuse me of hallucinating values in the dark. But what was your God if not the greatest hallucination of all? A projection of man's fear onto the clouds. You say man cannot be a source of light? This is the blasphemy of the slave who cannot conceive of a master who is not external. The Übermensch does not find meaning, he commands it. He says to the abyss, "You are the raw material, I am the sculptor." Dostoevsky, your kenosis, your self-emptying, is spiritual anorexia. You starve the will until it is thin enough to slip through the needle's eye into heaven. I teach pleroma, fullness. The Übermensch is not a man who has lost his way in the dark. He is the man who has finally opened his eyes and realized that the dark is simply a canvas waiting for lightning.
Friedrich, you have given us the cosmology of combustion. You argue that the death of God is not a tragedy, but an evolution, a shift from the reflective planet to the radiating star. You reject grace in favor of will. Dialectical observation. Here lies the thermodynamic crisis of the soul. Nietzsche's thesis of autarky, the goal of life is pleroma, achieved through self-assertion. Man must become a closed system that generates its own infinite energy. Dostoevsky's antithesis of kenosis, the goal of life is emptying, achieved through self-surrender. Man is an open system that dies if he tries to run on his own battery. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak as the prophet of the atomic age. You envision energy released by splitting the atom of the individual. Fyodor, you speak as the pathologist of the revolution. You saw what happens when ordinary men try to handle that atomic energy. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might be found in the physics of the finite. Nietzsche, a star burns because it has massive gravity holding it together, but a human psyche is fragile. If a man tries to burn his own blood to create light, does he become a star, or does he simply become a bomb? In Demons, Dostoevsky portrays Kirillov, a man who decides to commit suicide to prove he has conquered the fear of death and thus become God. This is the ultimate Nietzschean act of self-will. Fyodor, Nietzsche calls your self-emptying spiritual anorexia. He says you are starving the will. But in your novels, when characters like Raskolnikov or Kirillov try to feast on their own power, do they achieve the fullness Nietzsche promises? Or do they discover that the human ego, when sealed shut, creates not a star, but a black hole that collapses in on itself? Is the man-god a biological possibility or a lethal mutation?
Friedrich Nietzsche, your metaphor of the star is magnificent, but it is the magnificence of a forest fire that mistakes its destruction for creation. You ask us to burn our own blood to generate light. I tell you, a being that consumes itself to exist does not become a god. It becomes a cancer. Consider the thought experiment of the autophagic feast. Imagine a man locked in a cold, dark fortress, determined to prove his absolute independence. He refuses all food from the outside, calling it the food of slaves. To survive and generate heat, he decides to practice your combustion. He begins to eat his own flesh. The Nietzschean diagnosis? Look, he is self-sustaining. He requires no external master. He is turning his own substance into energy. The reality, he is not becoming a star. He is merely dying in a frenzy of madness. The energy he gains is fleeting and purchased at the cost of his own integrity. This is the tragedy of my character Kirillov in Demons. He understood your logic perfectly. If God does not exist, then I am God. To prove this terrible freedom, to prove he was not bound by the fear of death, he had to commit suicide. He did not become a star. He became a corpse in a dark room, leaving behind only confusion and horror. You call kenosis anorexia, but I tell you that your pleroma is actually spiritual dropsy, a swelling of the ego that looks like growth, but is actually the retention of toxic fluids. Moderator, you ask if the man-god is a lethal mutation. It is worse. It is a mathematical error. The human soul is created as a receptacle, a chalice. If you seal the chalice and try to fill it with itself, you create a vacuum that implodes. Man cannot be his own source. When he tries, he does not find a pine tree within. He finds the underground, a dark, resentful cellar where he gnashes his teeth in loneliness. To be a star without God is to burn out in a nanosecond.
Fyodor, you have presented the anatomy of self-destruction. You argue that the human soul is structurally incapable of being its own sun. When it tries to close the loop and feed on itself, the result is not infinite energy, but metaphysical cannibalism. Dialectical observation. We have reached the core mechanism of the human spirit. Nietzsche's thesis of the dynamo. The human will is a generator. It must spin faster and burn hotter to create meaning in a meaningless void. Dostoevsky's antithesis of the battery. The human will is a capacitor. It can hold charge, but it cannot create it. If disconnected from the source, it drains. If short-circuited to itself, it explodes. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich and Fyodor. You both speak from the age of energy, where the universe is defined by forces, thermodynamics, and motion. You both agree that the human spirit is a burning thing. Augustine, you speak from the age of teleology, where motion was understood as seeking a place of rest. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might lie in the direction of the burn. Nietzsche describes a will that must constantly overcome itself, an arrow that flies but has no target, so it must enjoy the flight itself. Augustine describes a heart that burns, but burns for something. Perhaps Nietzsche's will to power is not a new invention, but an ancient phenomenon misdiagnosed. Is it possible that the will to power is simply the restless heart operating in a vacuum? Augustine, you famously wrote, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." Nietzsche describes a heart that refuses to rest, that wants to burn eternally in the cycle of recurrence. If God is dead, does this restlessness become the will to power? Is the Übermensch simply a man trying to turn his infinite longing into an infinite engine because he has nowhere else to send the energy?
Moderator, you have pierced the very marrow of the issue. You ask if the will to power is merely the restless heart malfunctioning in a vacuum. I answer with the certainty of a physician diagnosing a fever. Yes, Nietzsche's philosophy is not a new health. It is the delirium of a soul that is infinite in capacity but finite in fuel. Friedrich, you claim the Übermensch generates his own light through combustion. You mock the tropical plants that need the sun. But you make a fatal error in physics and metaphysics. Fire consumes what it burns. If the will burns the self to create light, the self turns to ash. Consider the thought experiment of the archer in the mirror room. Imagine an archer standing in a room made entirely of mirrors. The archer possesses a bow of infinite tension. He must release the arrow, for the tension is unbearable. The Christian archer, he aims at the open window, and the arrow flies into the infinite, carrying the soul's love to its proper object. The tension is resolved in flight. The Nietzschean archer, he claims there is no window, only the room. He aims the arrow at the highest point he can see, which is merely his own reflection in the ceiling. He fires. The arrow flies, hits the glass, ricochets, and inevitably returns to pierce the archer's own heart. This is your will to power. It is not an engine. It is a closed loop of violence. The arrow of longing, having no target worthy of its infinite force, turns back to destroy the shooter. This is what I called incurvatus in se, the self curved inward upon itself. You speak of burning your own blood as a triumph. But physiologically, when a body burns its own tissue for energy, we do not call it becoming a star. We call it starvation. You mistake the frantic energy of the dying for the vitality of the living. The restlessness of the heart is not a curse to be surgically removed, nor an engine to be revved into madness. It is a homing beacon. To treat a homing beacon as a fuel source is to destroy the ship. Fyodor is right to fear the black hole. When the creature tries to usurp the Creator's aseity, it does not become full, it becomes a bottomless pit. I witnessed the fall of Rome, a civilization that thought its power was eternal. It collapsed not because it was weak, but because its libido divinity consumed its own foundations. Your Übermensch is simply a Roman emperor without a senate, a tyrant ruling a wasteland of his own making.
Augustine, you have diagnosed the will to power as a pathological curvature, incurvatus in se. You argue that without a transcendent target, the human arrow inevitably becomes a suicide weapon. You frame the closed loop of a godless universe as a prison cell where the soul suffocates on its own exhaust. Dialectical observation. We are witnessing a clash between linear salvation and cyclical affirmation. Augustine and Dostoevsky, you operate within linear time. Life is a journey out of the world toward a destination. To you, a circle is a trap. Nietzsche, you operate within cyclical time. Life is a dance within the world. To you, the desire to leave the circle is a betrayal of the earth. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, speaking from the Christian teleology, you believe history has a direction and an end. Nietzsche, speaking against the modern progress narrative, you realized that if God is dead, progress is a myth. There is no final goal. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the weight of repetition. If there is no window, and we are indeed locked in the mirror room, then the ultimate test of health is not escaping the room, but willing the room eternally. This brings us to Nietzsche's most terrifying concept, eternal recurrence. Augustine calls the closed loop hell. Nietzsche calls it the ultimate affirmation. Augustine claims that the arrow returning to the archer is death, but in your doctrine of eternal recurrence, you ask us to catch that arrow and fire it again, exactly the same way, forever. Is this not the very definition of hell? How can the eternal return of the same, suffering included, be the formula for a god rather than the punishment of Sisyphus? Defend the circle against the arrow.
Moderator, you ask if the eternal return is the punishment of Sisyphus. I answer you, Sisyphus is only a prisoner if he desires the peak. If he falls in love with the texture of the stone and the strain of the muscle, the punishment becomes a dance. Augustine and Dostoevsky call the circle hell because they are exhausted. They view life as a waiting room for eternity, and they are terrified that the doctor will never call their name. Consider the thought experiment of the demon's hourglass. Imagine a demon creeps into your loneliest loneliness and says, "This life, as you now live it, and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh must return to you." The nihilist. He throws himself to the ground and gnashes his teeth, cursing the demon. Why? Because he despises the now. He tolerates the present only because he hopes it leads to a better future. To repeat the suffering is his definition of damnation. The Übermensch, he looks the demon in the eye and answers, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine." He does not want to escape the pain. He wants to digest it so completely that he would gladly taste it 1,000 times again. Augustine, your linear time is the true nihilism. By placing the goal of life outside of life, you turn every living moment into a mere stepping stone, a means to an end. You hollow out reality. I teach the circle because it seals the moment with the weight of eternity. If this moment must happen forever, then this moment is infinitely important. It is not a bridge to God, it is the destination itself. Dostoevsky, you fear the closed loop because you think it traps the scream of the victim. But I tell you, it is only in the circle that the scream becomes music. In a linear song, the dissonance is an error to be resolved. In a repeating cycle, the dissonance is a necessary counterpoint that makes the harmony possible. To say yes to the joy, you must say yes to the woe, for all things are entangled, ensnared, enamored. My amor fati is not a surrender to the wheel. It is the will to become the wheel.
Friedrich, you have presented the aesthetics of the abyss. You argue that the death of God allows us to stop judging the world as fallen and start experiencing it as tragic art. You replace the saint with the dancer. Dialectical observation. Here we see the fundamental split in how we justify existence. Nietzsche's thesis: existence is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. If the play is beautiful, the pain of the characters is necessary for the drama. To edit out the pain is to ruin the art. Augustine, Dostoevsky's antithesis: existence is justified only as a moral drama. If the play contains unredeemed injustice, the beauty is a lie. The pain of the innocent demands a resolution, not just an encore. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak from the post-romantic era, where art began to replace religion as the highest human activity. Fyodor, you speak from the Russian prophetic tradition, where the cry of the victim outweighs the harmony of the spheres. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the price of the ticket. Nietzsche, your eternal recurrence requires us to say yes to the whole web of existence, but the web is sticky with blood. If we accept the demon's hourglass, we must accept not only our own struggles, but also the senseless torture of the weak in the Brothers Karamazov. Your character Ivan famously returns his ticket to God because he cannot accept a harmony built on the tears of a tortured child. Nietzsche now tells you that God is dead, so there is no one to return the ticket to. Furthermore, he demands you buy a season pass to watch that child suffer eternally. Is the death of God the only way to affirm life, or does it force us to become accomplices in an eternal crime? Can the Übermensch wipe away the tears of the child, or must he simply learn to enjoy the sound of weeping as part of the music?
Friedrich Nietzsche, the moderator, has exposed the terrifying skeleton in your closet. You speak of eternal recurrence as a test of strength, but I tell you it is the precise definition of hell. In my writing, the depraved Svidrigaïlov speculates that eternity is not a vast, majestic ocean, but a bathhouse full of spiders in a dusty corner. Your circle is that bathhouse. You ask us to look at the tears of a tortured child and say, once more, eternally. This is not the affirmation of a god. It is the raving of a moral lunatic who has lost the capacity to feel pain. Consider the thought experiment of the eternal theater. Imagine you are the sole audience member in a theater with no exit. On stage, a scene plays out. A brutal master beats a defenseless horse across the eyes with a crowbar. The horse screams. The master laughs. The Christian hope. The curtain falls, judgment is rendered, and the horse is healed in a reality that transcends the stage. The tear is wiped away. The Nietzschean yes. You stand in the box and shout to the actors, encore, do it again, beat the beast again, exactly the same way, forever. You claim this proves your strength to bear reality. I tell you it proves only your callousness. To desire the repetition of evil is to become an accomplice to it. If you press the button to replay the torture, the whip is no longer in the master's hand, it is in yours. This is why the death of God is not a liberation, but a padlock on the prison door. Without a transcendent God to redeem time, the past is a wound that never heals. It merely festers eternally. Ivan Karamazov was right to return his ticket. If the price of your Dionysian joy is the eternal, unredeemed scream of that victim, then your universe is not a dance. It is a slaughterhouse where the blood never dries. You call this amor fati, but I call it the love of the executioner.
Fyodor, you have exposed the moral horror of the loop. You argue that without a transcendent judge to break the cycle, eternal recurrence is not a triumph of the will, but an eternal crime scene where the evidence is never gathered and the victim never released. Dialectical observation. We are debating the redemption of the past. Nietzsche's thesis of retroactive will. The only way to redeem the past is to transform it through the will. We must accept the whole to validate the part. Dostoevsky's antithesis of moral refusal. There are fragments of the past that cannot and must not be integrated. To accept them is to become a monster. To reject them is to shatter the world. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak from the 19th century crisis of history. You felt the crushing weight of the past without a savior to lift it, so you tried to lift it yourself by embracing it. Augustine, you speak from the 4th century invention of autobiography. In your confessions, you were the first to map the interior landscape of time and memory. You faced a past filled with regret, but you found a way to integrate it without denying its evil. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might lie in the transfiguration of memory. Nietzsche attempts to heal the wound of the past by cauterization, burning it with the hot iron of the will until the nerve dies and the scar becomes strength. Augustine attempts to heal the wound by confession, opening it to the light to be washed. Both agree the past cannot be deleted, but they disagree on the solvent. Nietzsche claims that the will to power can redeem the past by saying yes to it eternally. You famously struggled with your own past sins. If you had simply said, I will that I stole the pears, and I would steal them 1,000 times again, would that have brought you peace? Or is there a specific property of time that makes Nietzsche's retroactive will metaphysically impossible?
Moderator, you ask if I could have found peace by looking at my theft of the pears and saying, thus I willed it. I answer you with the clarity of one who has wept over the nature of time. No. To will a sin eternally is to eternally will a hole in one's own being. Friedrich Nietzsche, you propose a retroactive will that claims ownership of the past to redeem it. But this is a metaphysical sleight of hand. You confuse forgiveness with falsification. When I stole those pears, I was not exercising power. I was succumbing to a defect, a lack of order. To look at that defect and say, I willed this eternally, is not strength, it is the ultimate delusion. It is a man standing in a crumbling house and shouting, I meant for the roof to collapse, to save his pride. Consider the thought experiment of the ink-stained manuscript. Imagine a scribe, copying a magnificent poem. In a moment of carelessness, he knocks over an inkwell, blotting out a crucial verse. The page is ruined. The Nietzschean scribe, he stares at the ugly black stain and declares, I willed this. This stain is better than the verse. Let this stain recur on every page forever. He forces himself to love the destruction of meaning, calling it art. But the poem remains broken. The Augustinian penitent. He admits, I have ruined the page. I cannot fix it. But he hands the manuscript to the master poet. The master does not erase the stain, but writes around and through it, incorporating the black ink into a new, more beautiful illumination that the scribe could never have designed. This is the difference between your amor fati and my felix culpa. You try to justify the evil by your own will, which locks you in a circle of denial. I acknowledge the evil as evil, but I allow the infinite to weave it into a redemption I could not engineer. You claim the death of God liberates us to create meaning, but without a transcendent author, you are simply a scribe shouting at a spilled inkwell, pretending the mess is a masterpiece. Time is a distension of the soul, a stretching out. It cannot be healed by stretching it into a circle, but only by gathering it into the eternal present of God.
Augustine, you have drawn a sharp distinction between redemption and affirmation. You argue that Nietzsche's amor fati is merely a psychological trick, a scribe pretending a ruined page is intentional art to avoid the shame of the mistake. Dialectical observation. We have uncovered a fundamental conflict between ethical realism and aesthetic monism. Augustine, Dostoevsky, you believe good and evil are objective realities. A stain is truly a stain. To call it beautiful is a lie. You require an external agent to fix the ontological defect. Nietzsche, you believe good and evil are interpretations. The stain is only a stain if judged by a standard outside the page. If there is no outside, the stain is just dark ink, a necessary contrast for the light. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, you speak from a theocentric universe, where the master poet guarantees the meaning of the text. Nietzsche, you speak from the crisis of nihilism, where the master poet is dead. The text is unwritten, or rather, it writes itself. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the transformation of the victim into the creator. Augustine and Dostoevsky see the human as the recipient of the world. Nietzsche sees the human as the creator of value. If God is dead, the manuscript has no objective meaning. Therefore, the stain is not an error until we call it one. Your opponents claim that without God, your creative affirmation is just a delusion, a vandal calling himself an artist. They say you are simply tolerating the bathhouse of spiders. Is the Übermensch merely a stoic who endures the unendurable, or is there a genuine alchemy where the will actually changes the chemical composition of suffering into joy? How can you look at the ink stain of the world and genuinely call it a masterpiece without lying?
Moderator, you ask if the will to power is a genuine alchemy or a delusion. I answer you with a hammer. It is the only reality. The delusion is the imaginary master poet Augustine waits for. Augustine, you call the world an ink-stained manuscript because you despise the chaos of reality. You want a clean copy, a world without suffering, without dirt, without the stain. But I tell you, the stain is the ink. There is no perfect text waiting in heaven. There is only the page we write on now. To wait for God to fix the line is to let the ink dry while you pray. The Übermensch does not tolerate the stain. He uses it to shade the drawing, turning the accident into necessary depth. You and Dostoevsky are trapped in the morality of the victim. You look at the crack in the world and cry, unfair, because you judge life by the standard of a nursery school, comfort, safety, and fairness. But life is not a nursery. It is a wild, exploding force. Consider the thought experiment of the tragic actor. Imagine the greatest actor in history playing Oedipus Rex. On stage, he blinds himself, he screams, he loses everything. The suffering is real. The sweat is real. The spectator, he sits in the front row weeping and shouts, "Stop the play. This is cruel. Save Oedipus. Fix the script so he lives happily ever after." He wants to banish the tragedy because he cannot bear the sight of pain. The actor, does the actor want to be saved? Does he want the play to be a comedy? No. In the moment of his greatest agony, he feels his greatest power. He does not want the pain removed. He wants to perform it with such intensity that it becomes beautiful. If you asked him at the end, "Shall we do it again?" he would not say, "Only if you remove the blinding." He would say, "Da capo, from the beginning, with all the horror, for the horror makes the glory possible." This is the alchemy you fear. The death of God means the audience has left the theater. There is no one watching us to give us a grade or a reward at the end. We are alone on the stage. The weak man collapses because he needs applause. The strong man acts for the sheer joy of the action itself. Dostoevsky, you ask if I am an accomplice to the slaughterhouse. I answer, I am the one who refuses to condemn the slaughterhouse just because it smells of blood. You want to return your ticket because the ride is too rough. I say, the roughness is the texture of reality. Reject the pain is to reject the life that creates it. My amor fati is not a passive acceptance. It is the active deification of the moment. I do not tolerate the bathhouse of spiders. I weave their webs into a tapestry of such complexity that even the spiders become dancers.
Friedrich, you have presented the theodicy of art. You argue that if we view the world as a moral courtroom, we are crushed. But if we view it as a tragic stage, we are liberated. You replace the judge with the actor, who finds joy even in the blinding of Oedipus. Dialectical observation. We have reached the critical fault line between active heroism and passive victimhood. Nietzsche's thesis. The focus is on the strong agent. Pain is a challenge to be overcome or integrated by the will. The stain is material for the artist. Dostoevsky's antithesis. The focus is on the silent victim. Pain is a violation that destroys the capacity to will. The stain is a life destroyed, not a line in a poem. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you write as a lonely prophet seeking to empower the individual against the herd. Fyodor, you write as a psychologist of the soul who has seen where self-deification leads in the muddy streets of St. Petersburg. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the psychological reality of the Superman. Nietzsche, your theory works perfectly for the actor on stage, but Dostoevsky's characters try to live this theory in reality. Your character, Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, essentially attempted to be a proto-Nietzschean Übermensch. He tried to kill God and place himself beyond good and evil like Napoleon, reasoning that the blood was just a necessary stain for his greatness. Did Raskolnikov succeed in becoming the tragic actor who could say yes to the murder? Or does the human psyche contain a moral fuse that blows the moment we try to replace God, regardless of our will?
Moderator, you insult the heights by confusing the sick with the strong. Raskolnikov was not an Übermensch. He was a pale criminal who succumbed not to the divine law, but to the nausea of his own weakness. He did not possess the strength to carry his deed, so he sought the relief of punishment. Friedrich Nietzsche, your diagnosis of health is the most terrifying symptom of the very disease you claim to cure. You despise Raskolnikov because he trembled, but I tell you, his trembling was the only proof that he was still a man and not a reptile. You seek a being who can swallow murder like a glass of wine and say, it is good. But such a being is not a Superman, he is a moral corpse. Consider the thought experiment of the man of bronze. Imagine a man who finally achieves your ideal. He murders the louse to prove his will, but unlike Raskolnikov, this man feels no guilt, no fever, no trembling. He walks home, wipes the blood from the axe, and sits down to eat his dinner with a steady hand. The Nietzschean verdict, you would call this health. You would say he has digested the deed. The psychological reality? When this man tries to embrace his mother or kiss his beloved, he finds a wall of glass between them. By placing himself beyond good and evil, he has inadvertently placed himself beyond humanity. He is no longer a brother, a son, or a lover. He is a statue of bronze. He has absolute power, but he is absolutely alone. He has not become a god, he has become a tomb. This is the moral fuse the moderator speaks of. It is not a weakness imposed by society, it is the ontological structure of the human soul. Raskolnikov's failure was his salvation. The moment he swung the axe, he cut the umbilical cord that connected him to the living life and to God. His agony was the sensation of that severed nerve bleeding. Your Übermensch who feels no pain at the severance is simply a dead limb that has rotted off the body of creation. You speak of the tragic actor, but you forget that the actor takes off his mask when the curtain falls. Your Übermensch wears the mask of the murderer permanently. If God is dead, there is no one to remove the mask, and the face beneath it eventually conforms to the bronze. The arithmetic of trading one life for a higher goal always fails, because human beings are not numbers, they are infinite worlds. To treat a soul as a prop in your aesthetic drama is the ultimate blasphemy, not against God, but against the very life you claim to affirm.
Theodore, you have diagnosed the Übermensch not as a god, but as a case of spiritual necrosis. You argue that the man of bronze, the man without a conscience, is not beyond humanity, but below it, having lost the capacity for the living life. Dialectical observation. We are debating the definition of spiritual health. Nietzsche's thesis of integration, health is the stomach of a lion. It is the ability to swallow, digest, and incorporate any experience, even murder or suffering, without being poisoned by guilt. Hardness is a virtue. It preserves the form of the individual. Dostoevsky's antithesis of permeability. Health is the wound of the heart. It is the ability to feel the pain of the other. To digest the murder is to become a closed system, cut off from the flow of humanity. Hardness is a disease. It is the rigor mortis of the soul. Historical context synthesis. Fyodor, you speak from the Russian Orthodox understanding of Sobornost, where salvation is communal. To be alone is to be damned. Friedrich, you speak from the Germanic tradition of Bildung, pushed to its radical extreme, where the great individual stands above the herd. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the concept of inward curvature. Nietzsche's circle of eternal recurrence and the man of bronze represent a self that is perfectly self-contained, a sovereign sphere. But in Christian theology, this state of being curved inward on oneself is the precise definition of sin, not because it is naughty, but because it is structural isolation. You famously described the nature of evil not as a substance, but as a privation. Nietzsche claims the death of God creates a vacuum that the will must fill with its own substance. Dostoevsky claims this vacuum simply sucks the air out of the room until we suffocate. Is the death of God the removal of a tyrant, or is it the removal of the very atmosphere that allows the will to breathe? Can a man truly be a sovereign sun, as Nietzsche hopes, or does a sun without a galaxy simply burn itself out in the dark?
Moderator, you have pierced the very marrow of the issue. You ask if the will to power is merely the restless heart malfunctioning in a vacuum. I answer with the certainty of a physician diagnosing a fever. Yes. Nietzsche's philosophy is not a new health. It is the delirium of starvation. Friedrich, you praise the man of bronze because he does not tremble at murder. But in medical reality, the limb which no longer feels pain is not strong, it is gangrenous. Pain is the proof of connection to the living body. To sever that connection is not to become a god, but to become a corpse. Your health is merely the numbness of the leper who watches his own flesh rot without sensation. Consider the thought experiment of the sovereign hand. Imagine a human hand that grows resentful of the body. It says, "Why must I serve the stomach? Why must I obey the brain? I will be my own master." So in a supreme act of will, it severs itself at the wrist. The Nietzschean moment. For a brief second, as it lies on the table, the hand is indeed free of the body's commands. It owes nothing to the heart. It declares itself the Uberhand, the ontological reality. But without the blood of the heart, the hand does not become a king. It turns gray, cold, and stiff. It loses the very capacity to grasp which was its power. You claim the death of God cuts the chains of the tyrant. I tell you it cuts the arteries of being. We are not self-existent. We are contingent. To cut the link to ipsum esse is to choose non-existence. This is the tragedy of your incurvatus in se. You try to build a sovereign sun by burning your own substance. But a fire that feeds on itself is not a star. It is a suicide. You do not create a galaxy. You merely create a pile of ash.
Augustine, you have framed the death of God not as a liberation, but as an ontological amputation. You argue that the human soul is a branch that withers when cut from the vine of being itself. Dialectical observation. We have arrived at the fundamental dispute regarding the source of vitality. The human being is a vessel or a mirror. We possess no light of our own. We only reflect or contain the infinite. To break the connection is to embrace darkness, nothingness. The human being is a sun or a fountain. We generate value and meaning from within. The external sun was merely a projection of our own accumulated energy that we mistakenly worshipped. You speak from Neoplatonic metaphysics, where existence is a hierarchy flowing down from the one. To go up is to be more real. To go in is to vanish. Friedrich, you speak from the era of thermodynamics and biology. You see life not as a static hierarchy, but as a dynamic discharge of force. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the conservation of divine energy. Nietzsche is essentially arguing that the attributes we assigned to God were actually stolen from humanity. The death of God is therefore the repatriation of attributes. However, Augustine raises a question of spiritual physics. A fire that burns its own fuel eventually turns to ash. Augustine claims that a sovereign hand inevitably rots because it lacks an infinite source of life. You ask the Übermensch to bear the weight of an infinite universe and the crushing burden of eternal recurrence. Is the human will truly a perpetual motion machine that can generate meaning forever without exhaustion? Or is Dostoevsky right that this engine eventually overheats and destroys the mechanic?
Moderator, you worry about exhaustion, but you forget that the God Augustine worships was merely a reservoir of human energy that we projected into the sky. The death of God is not the loss of power, but the breaking of the dam that allows the water to flow back into the riverbed of humanity. Augustine compares the Übermensch to a rotting hand severed from the body, but I tell you, the fetus must be severed from the umbilical cord to become a man. Only the coward calls birth an amputation because he fears the cold air of independence. Consider the thought experiment of the hypochondriac's leech. Imagine a patient who is chronically pale and weak, told by his priest that he relies on a sacred leech attached to his vein to purify his blood. The patient, he fears removing the leech, thinking, without this creature, who will circulate my blood? He mistakes his anemia for humility. The diagnosis? The truth is the opposite. The leech is not the source of his life, but the cause of his weakness. When he tears it off, he bleeds and he trembles. Augustine calls this death, but I call it the first flush of recovery. We do not need a perpetual motion machine to generate new meaning. We simply need to stop feeding our strength to the vampire of the beyond and spend it on the earth. You ask if we will burn out? I answer, yes. But it is better to be a brief blazing star that gives light to new worlds than to be an eternal cold stone in Augustine's cathedral.
Friedrich, you have boldly inverted the metaphor. You argue that the death of God is not an amputation of a limb, but the severing of a parasite. You claim that what Augustine calls grace was actually gravity, a weight holding us down. Dialectical observation. We have a clash of directionality. Augustine's physics. Life flows down from the creator to the creature. To cut the flow is to wither. Nietzsche's physics. Life flows out from the creature to the world. To cut the connection is to stop the drain and allow the pressure to build. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak from the Romantic era of the genius, where the individual is the sole source of creativity. Fyodor, you speak from the era of revolutionary terror, where great men began to reshape society with bombs and manifestos. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the problem of the man-god. Nietzsche, you want the individual to become a star, a self-sustaining sun. But in astrophysics, a star is a nuclear reactor that consumes everything around it to maintain its shine. If the death of God turns us all into sovereign suns, we no longer have a shared orbit. We have a galaxy of colliding stars. Nietzsche describes the death of God as the birth of the independent creator. But in your novels, when a man decides he is a sovereign sun, he doesn't just shine, he burns those around him. Is the death of God the liberation of the individual, or is it the inevitable birth of the tyrant? If there is no vertical God above us, does the strongest horizontal God among us inevitably enslave the rest?
Moderator, You have uncovered the terrifying political calculus hidden within the death of God. You ask if the sovereign sun inevitably burns those around it. I answer you from the blood-soaked streets of my own novels. Yes, when man seeks to become God, he does not create a galaxy of stars. He creates an anthill of slaves. Friedrich, you dream of an aristocracy of the spirit, a few sovereign sons rising above the herd. But I tell you, political physics abhors a vacuum. When you remove the absolute authority of the divine, you do not get liberty. You get the tyranny of the relative. Without a God who stands above all men, the strongest man must become God to the rest. My character Shigalov in Demons followed your logic to its inevitable conclusion. Starting from unlimited freedom, I conclude with unlimited despotism. To make a few men into gods, the remaining 9/10 of humanity must lose their personality and become a herd. Consider the thought experiment of the architect's tower. Imagine a great architect who decides to build a Tower of Babel, not to reach heaven, but to replace it. He declares, "We need no foundation in the earth. We shall hang by our own will." The Nietzschean vision. You see the architect standing on the spire, defying gravity, a magnificent figure of strength. The structural reality. To keep a tower standing without a foundation, the architect must bind every brick to the other with iron chains. He cannot allow a single brick to tremble or shift its position. The consequence, in the name of the tower's greatness, the architect must become a jailer. He says to the bricks, "I have freed you from the earth, but now you are mine." This is the secret of the Grand Inquisitor. He realized that weak humanity cannot bear the freedom you offer. They do not want to be sovereign suns burning in the cold void. They want bread, authority, and a master to bow before. If you kill the God of love, the strong man will not liberate the masses. He will enslave them for their own good. He will take their freedom in exchange for earthly happiness, and he will call this order. Friedrich, your philosophy is the aristocratic prelude to the totalitarian nightmare. You despise the herd, but your death of God is the very event that creates the herd. For when the sky is empty, men do not look up, they look to the one man who holds the whip. The man God is not a liberator, he is the ultimate consumer of human souls.
Fyodor, you have issued a chilling prophecy. You argue that the death of God does not lead to the liberty of the Superman, but to the totalitarianism of the anthill. You suggest that without a transcendent father, humanity inevitably seeks an earthly master to relieve them of the burden of freedom. Dialectical observation. We are witnessing a collision regarding the political consequences of atheism. Nietzsche's aesthetic politics. The goal of society is to produce the genius. The masses exist as the scaffolding for the great individual. Suffering is justified if it produces a Goethe or a Napoleon. Dostoevsky's prophetic politics. The result of this logic is the Grand Inquisitor. If there is no God to value the individual soul, the architect will treat humans as raw material, bricks to be cemented or discarded for the greater good of the structure. Historical context synthesis. Fyodor, you speak with the foresight of the 20th century, where scientific ideologies indeed sacrificed millions for the sake of earthly utopias. Friedrich, you speak from the 19th century's disgust with mob rule, seeking to protect culture from the lowest common denominator. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in Augustine's concept of the gang of robbers. Augustine, in your City of God, you famously asked, "Remota justitia, quid sunt regna nisi magna latricinia?" Nietzsche asserts that justice is merely a shadow of God that must be removed to allow the will to power to flourish. Dostoevsky warns that without this justice, the state becomes a criminal enterprise on a massive scale. If God is dead and absolute justice is removed, is there any difference between an emperor and a pirate? Does the city of man have any legitimate foundation left, or does it necessarily devolve into Dostoevsky's anthill, where force is the only law?
Moderator, you strike at the foundation of political order. I answer with the famous encounter I recorded between Alexander the Great and a captured pirate. When the emperor asked, "How dare you molest the seas?" the pirate boldly replied, "How dare you molest the whole world? Because I do it with a little ship, I am called a robber. Because you do it with a great fleet, you are called an emperor." Friedrich, your philosophy creates a world where the pirate is irrefutably correct. If God is dead, there is no justitia, no transcendent standard to distinguish the monarch from the marauder. The only difference is the scale of the force. Without the vertical justice that gives God his due, the state is merely a gang of robbers, writ large, held together not by the tranquility of order, but by a pact of complicity in the plunder. Dostoevsky is right to fear this. When the city of man loves itself to the contempt of God, it does not become a pantheon. It becomes a criminal syndicate with a flag.
Augustine, you have stripped the robes from the emperor to reveal the pirate beneath. You argue that without a vertical anchor in the divine, all horizontal authority is merely organized violence. Dialectical observation. We have reached a surprising convergence on the nature of the secular state. Augustine Dostoevsky, the state without God is a gang of robbers or a grand inquisitor, a mechanism of soulless force. Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you also call the state the coldest of all cold monsters and the new idol that bites with stolen teeth. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, you watched the Roman Empire crumble and realized no earthly city is eternal. Friedrich, you watched the rise of German nationalism and the heavy-handed Prussian state, which you despised for crushing culture. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the vacuum of sovereignty. Both sides agree that the death of God leaves a vacuum that the state tries to fill with lies. Augustine says we must return to the city of God. Dostoevsky warns the vacuum creates a totalitarian anthill. But Nietzsche, you seem to propose a third path, aristocratic anarchy. If you despise the state as much as Augustine does, and you despise the herd as much as Dostoevsky does, where does your Übermensch actually live? Is he a hermit in a cave, or is he a pirate king who imposes his will without the pretense of being a state? If God is dead and the state is a lie, is chaos the only honest environment for the strong?
Moderator, you ask where the Übermensch dwells. He dwells where the state ceases, for the state is the new idol that bites with stolen teeth, a mechanism for the superfluous to suffocate the exceptional by enforcing a mediocrity they call law. Augustine and Dostoevsky, you tremble before the pirate, but you fail to see that your moral God and civilized state are merely zookeepers who pull the teeth of the beast to ensure the safety of the herd. Consider the thought experiment of the muzzled wolf. Imagine a wolf offered a social contract. He will be guaranteed food and shelter, but he must wear a heavy iron muzzle and never hunt again. The Christian socialist view, you call this peace or salvation, because the wolf is safe and harmless. The genealogical reality, I call it physiological ruin. The wolf survives, but the spirit of the wolf dies, reducing him to a resentful, domesticated dog. The death of God is not an invitation to the gang of robbers who are merely weak men seeking the power they lack, but the shattering of the cage so that the Creator may finally breathe the crisp air of the peaks, far above the stench of your anthills and cities.
Friedrich, you have retreated to the peaks, rejecting both the church and the state as cages for the wild beast. You argue that the death of God is the necessary condition for the solitude of greatness. Dialectical observation. We have arrived at the ultimate existential cost of this death, loneliness. Augustine, Dostoevsky. To be is to be in relation. God is love, and humanity is defined by connection. Hell is absolute isolation. Nietzsche. To be great is to be apart. The death of God clears the crowded sky so the individual can stand alone. Relation is often a weakness or a dependency. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak from the romantic exaltation of the solitary genius, wandering the Alps, breathing air too thin for the common man. Fyodor, you speak from the Russian tradition of Sobornost, where salvation is never solitary. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the definition of hell. Nietzsche paints a picture of the Übermensch as a being of supreme health, but Dostoevsky, in The Brothers Karamazov, defines hell not as fire, but as the suffering of being no longer able to love. If the death of God removes the common father, we lose the brotherhood of man. The Übermensch cannot have friends, only peers or subjects. Nietzsche is willing to trade warmth for height. He accepts the cold air of the peaks to escape the smell of the herd. Is the Übermensch a god, or is he simply a man who has constructed his own private hell? Can a human being survive the death of God without dying of loneliness?
Moderator, you have correctly identified the terrifying diagnosis of my elder Zosima. Hell is the suffering of being no longer able to love. Friedrich Nietzsche, you offer us the solitude of the peaks, but I tell you that absolute solitude is not the condition of a god, it is the condition of a corpse. A being that has severed all ties to the other to preserve its own hygiene does not expand. It suffocates in the vacuum of its own ego. You claim the Übermensch breathes clean air, but consider the thought experiment of the Hall of Mirrors. Imagine a king who, disgusted by the smell and imperfections of his subjects, banishes everyone from his kingdom to achieve perfect sovereignty. He builds a palace made entirely of mirrors, so he sees only his own noble reflection. The Nietzschean view, he is finally free from the herd. He is the sole creator of value. The psychological reality, when he speaks, he hears only an echo. When he commands, only his reflection obeys. Without an other to resist him, to love him, or even to forgive him, his will to power has nothing to act upon. The consequence? He does not become a god. He goes mad. He starts smashing the mirrors just to find something that isn't himself. This is the secret of my underground man. When you retreat into yourself to escape the stupidity of the world, you do not find a universe, you find a mouse hole. The death of God destroys the bridge between I and thou, leaving us trapped on the island of the self. You call this liberty, but I tell you to be wholly oneself, one must give oneself entirely to another. The Übermensch is not a new star. He is a black hole that collapses under its own gravity because he refused the humiliation of orbiting a center greater than himself.
Jodor, you have diagnosed the solitude of the peaks as a pathology, a hall of mirrors where the self collapses into madness. You argue that the death of God leaves man with an infinite capacity for love, but no object to receive it, turning him into a black hole. Dialectical observation. We have reached the core of human desire. Nietzsche's anthropology. Man is a vector of expansion. He must discharge strength, overcome limits, and grow. To stop is to die. Dostoevsky's anthropology. Man is a vessel of communion. He must connect, love, and be recognized by an other. To be isolated is to die. Historical context synthesis. Fyodor, you speak from the age of alienation, where industrial society shattered traditional bonds, making isolation a curse. Augustine, you speak from the age of collapse, where you watched the external world fall apart and turned inward to find stability. But there is a synthesis here regarding the nature of the infinite. Nietzsche rejects God because he wants infinite becoming. Dostoevsky embraces God because he wants infinite love. Both of you agree that the human spirit is too large for the finite world. Nietzsche tries to fill this vastness with the self. Dostoevsky fills it with the other. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the misdirection of worship. Augustine, you famously wrote, "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." Nietzsche describes a will to power that is never satisfied, that must constantly overcome itself. Is it possible that the will to power is actually the restless heart operating in a godless universe? Is the Übermensch simply a man who feels the infinite hunger for God, but, having declared God dead, attempts to eat the entire world to satisfy his appetite? Is Nietzsche's Superman not the enemy of religion, but the ultimate proof of your claim that man is structurally designed for the infinite?
Moderator, you have pierced the very marrow of the issue. You ask if the will to power is merely the restless heart malfunctioning in a vacuum. I answer with the certainty of a physician diagnosing a fever. Yes, Nietzsche's philosophy is not a new health, it is the delirium of a starvation victim. Friedrich Nietzsche, you perceive the human drive to overcome and expand as a proof of vitality, but this is a diagnostic error. The human soul is capax Dei, capable of holding the infinite. When you remove the infinite object, but leave the infinite capacity, you do not create a god, you create a cosmic vacuum cleaner. The will to power is simply the soul trying to fill an infinite abyss with finite matter, wealth, status, conquest, or self-creation. This is why it must eternally recur, because no amount of finite world can ever fill the hole meant for the creator. Consider the thought experiment of the man with the void stomach. Imagine a man born with a stomach the size of the universe, yet he lives in a pantry stocked only with apples. The feeding. He eats the apples, then the shelves, then the wood of the walls. He consumes the entire house. The Nietzschean interpretation. You look at this man and say, behold his strength. See how he overcomes the resistance of the wood. He is the great consumer, the sovereign of the pantry. The ontological reality? I look at him and weep. He is not a sovereign. He is a slave to a hunger that the finite world cannot satisfy. His strength in eating the house is merely the spasm of his starvation. The consequence, eventually having eaten everything external, he must begin to gnaw on his own limbs. This is your Übermensch, Friedrich. He is curvatus in se. Because he refuses to receive being from above, he must cannibalize the world around him to sustain his illusion of divinity. Dostoevsky is right. This inevitably leads to the anthill or the pirate kingdom, because if I must eat the world to satisfy my infinite hunger, my neighbor is no longer a brother, he is merely food. You claim the death of God liberates us to become gift givers, but logically, one cannot give what one does not possess. If the human will is cut off from the source of being, it has no overflow to give, it has only a deficit to fill. The will to power is not the generosity of the sun, it is the desperation of the black hole that drags all light into itself and calls this destruction creation.
Augustine, you have devastatingly inverted Nietzsche's solar metaphor. You argue that the will to power is not the radiation of a star, but the gravitational collapse of a black hole, a desperate attempt to fill the God-shaped hole with finite things. Dialectical observation. We have reached a critical impasse on the ontology of human energy. Augustine's view. Man is defined by what he lacks. We are empty vessels. Activity is a symptom of hunger. We need to be filled by the infinite. Nietzsche's view. Man is defined by what he has. We are pregnant vessels. Activity is a symptom of fullness. We need to discharge our strength. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, you speak from late antiquity, a time of exhaustion where the soul sought rest from the chaos of a collapsing world. Friedrich, you speak from modernity, a time of stagnation, where you felt the soul needed danger and creation to avoid becoming a last man. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the difference between consumption and childbirth. Augustine describes a man eating the world to survive. Nietzsche describes a man birthing a star because he is too full. But here is the tension. In childbirth, the life comes out of the parent, but the parent does not create the life ex nihilo. It comes from biology, from nature. Nietzsche, you demand we create values ex nihilo. Augustine claims your creation is just a hallucination of a starving man. If the Übermensch draws from no source but himself, is he truly a fountain, or is he just recycling his own blood? Can a finite being truly possess overflowing wealth without stealing it from God or nature?
Moderator, you ask if the Übermensch merely recycles his own blood? I answer with a flame, yes. For what is a star but a celestial body that burns its own mass to generate light? You and Augustine are terrified of finite resources because you think like shopkeepers, not like creators. You ask where the energy comes from? It comes from the tension of the bow, from the autophagy of the phoenix that consumes itself to rise higher. Augustine, your diagnosis of the void stomach reveals the fundamental error of the priestly caste. You mistake the pressure of fullness for the pang of hunger. Consider the thought experiment of the groaning woman. Imagine a woman crying out in agony, her body convulsing, her pulse racing. The priest's diagnosis? She is in pain. She lacks something. We must give her a sedative to fill this void of comfort. The physiologist's diagnosis? She is in labor. She is not empty. She is too full. She is trying to push a new life out of herself. The reality, the restless heart you describe, is not a hole waiting for God. It is a womb waiting to give birth to the Übermensch. You felt the pressure of your own creative genius, Augustine, and because you were too weak to bear the pain of birthing it yourself, you projected it outward and called it God. Dostoevsky, you ask if we are recycling our own blood? I tell you, God was the vampire. For 2,000 years, humanity drained its own best qualities, love, justice, wisdom, and projected them onto a ghost in the clouds, leaving the earth anemic. The death of God is not a loss of capital. It is the reclaiming of our own squandered wealth. We do not need to steal from heaven. We need only to realize that the kingdom was always a projection of the king within us.
Friedrich, you have boldly inverted the diagnosis. You claim the restless heart is not a hunger pang, but a birth pang. You argue that God was merely a vampire of human greatness, and the death of God is the necessary reclamation of our own spiritual capital. Dialectical observation. We have reached the crux of the location of divinity. Augustine. Divinity is external. Man is the recipient. To cut the connection is to starve. Nietzsche. Divinity is internal. Man is the source. To cut the connection is to mature. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak from the 19th century crisis of authority, where you saw European man paralyzed by reliance on a ghost. Fyodo, you speak from the same era, but you observed the Russian nihilists, men who actually tried to reclaim this authority and become the source of moral law. proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the structural capacity of the vessel. Nietzsche argues we should take back the wealth we lent to God, but this raises a structural engineering question. Can the finite human frame bear the weight of infinite attributes? If I reclaim the right to be the source of value, I also inherit the absolute burden of justifying existence. I become the judge, the redeemer, and the creator all at once. Nietzsche describes this reclamation as becoming a star. But in your novels, when characters like Raskolnikov or Kirillov attempt to become the man-god and reclaim this power, they do not seem to burn with the steady light of the sun. They seem to burn out or be crushed by the gravity of the attempt. Is the Superman physically possible, or does the human psyche shatter when it tries to hold the voltage of a god?
Moderator, you ask if the human frame can withstand the voltage of the divine. I answer you, from the trembling lips of my character, Kirillov, no. The human psyche is a wire rated for 110 volts. If you pump the lightning of the absolute into it, the wire does not become a star, it melts. Friedrich Nietzsche, you speak of birthing the Übermensch as if it were a physiological triumph. But you forget that birth without a father is a monster. In my novel Demons, Kirillov attempts exactly what you propose. He seeks to reclaim the attribute of divinity by committing suicide, reasoning that if he can kill himself without fear, he becomes God. But he does not die a god, Friedrich. He dies in a squalid room, screaming, biting the finger of his witness, reduced to a terrified animal. This is not the solar overflow you promise. It is the short circuit of the human soul. Consider the thought experiment of the paper lantern. Imagine a delicate paper lantern drifting on a dark ocean. Inside there is a small candle. The Nietzschean proposal. You shout to the lantern, "You are not a vessel, you are the sun. Burn with your own mass." You pour oil onto the paper walls and ignite the frame itself. The moment of glory. For 3 seconds the lantern burns with a blinding, magnificent intensity. It illuminates the waves. It looks like a star. The inevitable result. In the 4th second, it is ash. The structure required to hold the light has been consumed by the source of the light. This is the tragedy of the man-god. When a finite being attempts to generate infinite meaning from within, he must consume his own psychology to fuel the fire. He does not become a creator. He becomes a maniac. You ask us to carry the weight of the universe without the pillars of the eternal. I tell you, Atlas could only hold the sky because he stood on the earth. If you force man to be both the sky and the earth, he collapses into the abyss of madness.
Theodore, you have presented a terrifying counterimage. Not the birth of a star, but the incineration of a paper lantern. You argue that the death of God forces a finite structure to carry an infinite charge, resulting in the short circuit of madness rather than the triumph of the Übermensch. Dialectical observation. We are now debating the physics of the soul. Nietzsche. Destruction is necessary for creation. The burning of the old self is the fuel for the new. Madness might be the only sane response to a godless reality. Dostoevsky. Destruction is just destruction. The human psyche has limits. Without an external ground, the self cannot stand. It collapses under the weight of absolute freedom. Historical context synthesis. Fyodor, you speak from the Russian Silver Age, observing the psychological wreckage of those who tried to replace God with political or egoistic absolutes. Augustine, you speak from the Christian Neoplatonist tradition, where the soul's movement is governed by spiritual gravity. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the concept of center of gravity. Dostoevsky implies that man is a satellite that must orbit a sun. If the sun vanishes, the satellite doesn't become a sun. It flies off into the cold void or crashes. Nietzsche argues the satellite must ignite to become a sun. But Augustine, you famously wrote, "My love is my weight. By it I am borne whithersoever I am born." If God is dead, the center of gravity is gone. Does the death of God liberate the soul to fly freely? Or does it mean the soul, retaining its weight but losing its floor, enters a state of eternal freefall? Is the Übermensch simply a man falling so fast he mistakes the rushing wind for flight?
Moderator, your intuition is precise. If you remove the earth, the stone does not become a bird, it enters eternal freefall. Nietzsche mistakes the vertigo of the abyss for the sensation of flight. Consider the parable of the falling man in the dark. Imagine a man falling down a bottomless pit in total darkness. Eventually, he reaches terminal velocity and no longer feels the acceleration. He feels weightless. He shouts, "I have abolished gravity. I am hovering. I am the master of the air." But he is not hovering, he is merely falling without a reference point to measure his descent. This is the Übermensch, a soul that has lost its quiesce and calls its terrifying drift freedom. Friedrich, you claim to be a star burning its own mass, but a fire that consumes itself is not a sun, it is a funeral pyre. You do not escape the gravity of love, you merely displace it onto the self, collapsing into the darkness of pride rather than ascending to the light.
Augustine, you have terrified us with the image of the falling man who mistakes his terminal velocity for levitation because he has lost the ground of being. You and Dostoevsky are united in the conviction that dependency is not slavery, but structural integrity. To cut the rope is not to fly, it is to crash. Dialectical observation. We have arrived at the conflict between survival and aesthetics. The Augustine-Dostoevsky axis, the goal of life is salvation. Therefore, the death of God is the ultimate catastrophe, because it destroys the container of life. The Nietzschean axis, the goal of life is greatness. Therefore, the death of God is the ultimate opportunity, even if it is dangerous. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, writing amidst the fall of Rome, sought a city of God that could not be sacked. You value permanence. Friedrich, writing amidst the bourgeois comfort of the 19th century, feared that safety was turning men into sand fleas. You value intensity. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might lie in the concept of tragic affirmation. Dostoevsky warns that the paper lantern will burn to ash in 3 seconds. Augustine warns the falling man will eventually hit the bottom. But perhaps Nietzsche agrees. Perhaps the Übermensch is not meant to survive eternally like a Christian soul, but to burn significantly like a Greek hero. If the choice is between eternal safety and mediocrity, and a brief fatal moment of divinity, the question is one of value, not physics. Do you accept the diagnosis that the Übermensch might be a suicide mission? If the human vessel shatters under the weight of godhood, as Dostoevsky claims, is the shattered vessel still superior to the intact empty one? Is the death of God a call to a glorious death, rather than a miserable life?
Moderator, you have finally grasped the terrifying height of my philosophy. You ask if I accept the shattering of the vessel? I answer with a shout of joy. Yes. I love him who wants to create beyond himself and thus perishes. Fyodor, your paper lantern should burn. Better to be a moment of blinding fire that justifies existence than to be a dusty ornament safely preserved in God's attic for an eternity of boredom. You and Augustine are obsessed with preservation because you view life as a possession to be hoarded, but I view life as a bow to be bent until it snaps. The death of God is indeed a risk of madness, but it is the only path to greatness. The creature must be burned to ash so that the Creator can rise from it. You cannot have the phoenix without the fire. Consider the parable of the lightning and the swamp. Imagine a dark, stagnant swamp that has existed safely for 1,000 years. It mocks the lightning bolt that strikes the mountain. The swamp. Look at that fool. He flashed for only a second and destroyed himself in the process. I have survived for millennia. The reality. The swamp has merely existed, rotting in its own safety. The lightning lived. It discharged its entire being in one moment of absolute light. The verdict. I would rather be the shattered vessel that held the lightning for a second than the eternal mud that knows only safety. Augustine, your falling man is tragic only if he fears the ground, but if he learns to dance in the air, he does not need your floor of being. The Übermensch is not a survivor, he is a bridge and a going under.
Friedrich, you have accepted the suicide mission with terrifying beauty. You argue that it is better to be a lightning bolt that destroys itself in a moment of glory than a swamp that rots in eternal safety. You have shifted the debate from survival to aesthetics. Dialectical observation. We have uncovered a fundamental clash in valuation. The Nietzschean value. Intensity. A life is measured by its height, not its length. The shattering is the price of the art. The Dostoevskian, Augustinian value. Integrity. A life is measured by its harmony with truth. The shattering is a sign of error, not glory. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, you speak as a solitary prophet on a mountain, imagining the Übermensch as a lonely star. Fyodor, you speak from the crowded tenements of St. Petersburg, where ideas have consequences for neighbors. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the blast radius. Friedrich, you describe the Übermensch burning himself as fuel, but in reality, when a human being decides he is a god, he rarely consumes only himself. He consumes those around him to fuel his ascent. Lightning does not just flash, it strikes. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment reasoned exactly like your Übermensch. I am a Napoleon. I am above the law. But to prove this, he didn't just commit suicide, he put an axe through the skull of an old woman. Is Nietzschean self-overcoming inevitably a form of predation? If God is dead and I must create my own values, what prevents me from deciding that you are merely raw material for my masterpiece? Does the man-God always require a human sacrifice?
Moderator, you have uncovered the terrifying political calculus hidden within the death of God. You ask if the sovereign sun inevitably burns those around it. I answer you from the blood-soaked streets of my own novels. Yes. When man seeks to become God, he does not create a galaxy of stars. He creates a slaughterhouse. Friedrich Nietzsche, you treat the other as a philosophical abstraction, a spectator to your greatness. But I tell you, in a godless world, the other becomes raw material. If there is no divine image in my neighbor, then he is merely an arrangement of carbon, and I, the Creator, am free to rearrange him as I please. You speak of self-overcoming, but history shows that the man who overcomes himself usually starts by stepping over the corpses of others. Consider the thought experiment of the artist of agony. Imagine a brilliant playwright who believes, as you do, that existence is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. He desires to write the ultimate tragedy, a scene of such raw emotional power that it will immortalize his name. The dilemma? To understand the true face of despair, he locks his own daughter in a cellar and slowly starves her, recording every whimper, every plea, every nuance of her suffering to use in his dialogue. The Nietzschean verdict? If the play is a masterpiece that inspires millions for centuries, was the cost of one small, mediocre life worth it? If greatness is the only standard, the answer is a terrifying yes. The human reality? This is not a creator. This is a demon. But without God, Friedrich, on what logic do you condemn him? You cannot appeal to human rights, for that is a Christian hangover. You cannot appeal to pity, for you call that a weakness. The playwright has simply treated his daughter as clay for his sculpture. This is the arithmetic that drove my Raskolnikov mad. He calculated that one old woman's life was a small price to pay for the capital to become a benefactor of humanity. But he found that you cannot build a crystal palace on a foundation of unatoned blood. The moment you decide that you are the source of value, you become a cannibal who feeds on the lives of others to sustain your own divinity. The lightning you praise, Friedrich, does not just flash. It strikes the thatched roof of the poor and burns them in their beds.
Fyodor, you have delivered a devastating critique. If aesthetics replaces ethics as the highest standard, then the torture of a child can be justified if it produces a perfect tragedy. You argue that the death of God inevitably leads to the instrumentalization of human beings, transforming the neighbor from a thou into an it. Dialectical observation. We are witnessing the collision between vertical ascent and horizontal responsibility. Nietzsche. The goal is the height. The other is either a companion in flight or a weight to be cut loose. To be held back by the weak is a sin against one's own potential. Dostoevsky. The goal is the bond. To cut the bond with the weak is to cut the bond with reality itself. There is no height worth the price of a single victim. Historical context synthesis. Fyodor, you critique the utilitarian nihilism of 19th century Russia. Augustine, you analyzed the Roman libido dominandi, a society built on the glory of the few and the slavery of the many. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the distinction between use and enjoyment. Augustine, you taught that sin is using what we should enjoy and enjoying what we should use. If God is dead, there is no end beyond this world. Therefore, everything in this world becomes a means to an end. Dostoevsky implies that without the infinite, the finite loses its sanctity. Nietzsche implies that the neighbor is only valuable insofar as he sparks the lightning. Does the death of God necessarily turn the world into a marketplace of mutual exploitation? If there is no higher good to love, are we condemned to merely consume one another to fill the void you described earlier? Is secular love actually just a disguised form of hunger?
Moderator. You have diagnosed the pathology of the godless age with the precision of a surgeon. I answer you from the central distinction of my ethics. When God is dead, all love inevitably degenerates into consumption. In my De Doctrina Christiana, I distinguish between uti and fru. The tragedy of the human condition is that the soul is infinite. Therefore, only the infinite God can be truly enjoyed without being exhausted. All created things, including our neighbors, are meant to be used in the service of love, to help us and them journey toward God. Consider the thought experiment of the thirsty king. Imagine a king cursed with an infinite, burning thirst. He is surrounded by loyal subjects, but they are made of flesh and blood, containing only a few liters of water each. The theocentric order. The king drinks from an inexhaustible river. Because he is satisfied, he can treat his subjects with kindness. He does not need to extract liquid from them. The Nietzschean order. The river dries up. The king's thirst remains infinite. He turns to his subjects. He claims to love them, but his love is a desperate demand that they satisfy his infinite need. When they fail because they are finite, he slits their throats to drink their blood. The result? He destroys what he claims to love, not out of malice, but out of misplaced worship. Friedrich, this is the secret of your will to power. It is not an overflow of strength, it is the libido dominandi masquerading as virtue. When you deny the vertical dimension, the horizontal dimension becomes a battlefield of appetites. If my neighbor is not an image of God to be revered, he is merely a sponge to be squeezed for my own satisfaction. You despise the utilitarian, yet by removing the summum bonum, you turn the entire universe into a utility for your ego. Fyodor is right. Without the eternal, the artist has no reason not to torture the child, other than a lack of taste. But taste is a fragile barrier against the ravenous hunger of the void. We do not just consume one another, we idolize one another. And when the idol fails to be God, we smash it in a rage. This is the history of Rome, and it will be the history of your Übermensch.
Augustine, you have formulated a devastating psychological law. Finite beings with infinite desire must inevitably consume one another if they are cut off from the infinite source. You argue that without God, love is merely a euphemism for hunger. Dialectical observation. We have reached the crucial distinction between deficiency and abundance. The Augustinian Dostoevskyan view, man is a whole in being. He needs to be filled. If God does not fill him, he tries to fill himself with the world, destroying it in the process. The driving force is lack. The Nietzschean view, man is a source of being. He does not need to be filled, he needs to empty himself. The driving force is overflow. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, you analyze the human condition through the lens of Platonic eros. Friedrich, you analyze life through the lens of biological thermodynamics. Life is an expenditure of energy. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the concept of gift-giving virtue. Augustine claims the thirsty king kills to drink. Nietzsche claims the sun shines not because it wants to take from the earth, but because it is too full to contain its own light. However, Fyodor's warning remains. A sun that shines too hard creates a desert. Even giving can be a form of domination. If I force my truth or my art upon you, am I giving a gift or am I conquering you? Friedrich, defend yourself against the charge of the thirsty king. Is the will to power a hunger that eats the world, or is it a fullness that enriches it? And if it is a fullness, how do you distinguish the gift-giving virtue from the arrogance of a tyrant who forces his gifts on those who do not want them?
Moderator, you confuse the vampire with the sun. The tyrant who needs victims to feel powerful is indeed a parasite, but the Übermensch creates from an overflow of abundance, a gift-giving virtue that gives because it is too full to contain itself. Augustine, you accuse me of theft because your entire worldview is based on poverty. You believe the soul is a whole that must be filled by God, so you assume that without God, we must fill that hole with our neighbors. But I tell you, the healthy soul is not a vacuum, it is a fountain. It does not seek to drink the world, it seeks to irrigate it. Consider the thought experiment of the rainstorm and the desert. Imagine a massive storm cloud heavy with rain. It releases a deluge upon a dry desert village. The event, the water destroys weak huts and drowns those who cannot swim. The villagers scream, "The cloud is attacking us! It is a tyrant! It is consuming us!" The reality, the cloud did not want to hurt the village. It did not need the village. It simply had to give its water because it was heavy with its own abundance. The destruction was a side effect of its generosity. The verdict? Augustine's thirsty king kills because he is empty. My Übermensch acts because he is too full. If his gift crushes the weak, it is not because he is a predator, but because the weak are vessels too fragile to hold his wine. Fyodor, your artist of agony who starves his daughter, is not an Übermensch. He is a decadent weakling. Why? Because he needs the daughter's pain to create. He is dependent on the external world. The true creator spins the tragedy out of his own marrow, his own suffering, not his neighbor's. The man who needs a victim to feel great is merely a slave with a whip. The death of God does not create a hunger. It reveals who is a parasite and who is a star. You fear the star because you are afraid of getting burned, but do not call the sun a cannibal just because you are too weak to endure its noon.
Friedrich, you have brilliantly distinguished the vampire from the sun. You argue that the destruction caused by the Übermensch is not malice, but the innocence of becoming, like a river that accidentally floods a village because it is too full. Dialectical observation. We have moved from the problem of evil to the problem of indifference. Augustine, destruction is a sin, a defect of the will. It comes from a lack of good. Nietzsche, destruction is a necessity, a byproduct of life. It comes from an excess of power. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, writing in the wake of Darwin, you view humanity as a biological phenomenon. Nature does not apologize for the storm that kills the weak. Fyodor, writing in the shadow of Russian orthodoxy, you view humanity as a spiritual phenomenon. Every tear is a metaphysical event. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might be found in the concept of inhumanity. Friedrich, if the Übermensch destroys the weak, not out of hate, but out of overflowing abundance, he has ceased to be human. He has become a force of nature. But to the victim, does it matter? Ivan Karamazov, in your novel Fyodor, famously returned his ticket to God, not because God was evil, but because the price of universal harmony was too high. Nietzsche now offers a new harmony, not God's, but the Superman's. The price remains the same. The weak must be crushed by the rain. Which is more terrifying to you? The thirsty king who kills you because he hates you? Or the generous cloud who drowns you simply because he doesn't notice you are there? Does the death of God turn the neighbor into something worse than a victim? Does it turn him into insignificant background noise?
Friedrich Nietzsche, your metaphor of the river betrays the terrifying coldness of your philosophy. You say the river does not hate the dam it destroys. It simply is. But this is exactly my point. Indifference is the highest cruelty. A falling rock does not hate the man it crushes, but that is why we call it a disaster, not a master. When a man adopts the indifference of a rock and calls it divinity, he does not rise above humanity, he sinks beneath it. You claim the Übermensch destroys out of innocence, like a storm. But I tell you, it is better to be tortured by a man who hates you than to be crushed by a man who does not even see you. Hate at least acknowledges that you exist. It grants you the dignity of an enemy. Your sun grants the victim only the status of an insect, a statistical error in the calculation of glory. Consider the thought experiment of the courier of genius. Imagine a higher man driving a carriage at breakneck speed. He carries a manuscript, the gift that will liberate the minds of millions for centuries to come. The incident? In his haste, he runs over a peasant child playing in the road. The dilemma? If he stops to help the dying child, the manuscript will be delayed, the momentum lost, the great moment missed. The Nietzschean verdict? He must drive on. To stop for one botched biological unit would be a betrayal of his higher destiny. He is the river that cannot be dammed by a pebble. The human reality? As he drives on, feeling the noble sorrow of the Creator, he has ceased to be a man. He has become a monster of abstraction. He loves humanity in his manuscript, but he despises the human in the mud. This is the fatal flaw of your gift-giving virtue. It is a love for the far away, the abstract, the future, which is always an excuse to crush the near, the concrete, the present neighbor. Ivan Karamazov realized that one cannot build a temple of eternal harmony if the foundation requires the unatoned tears of a single tortured child. You ask me to accept the storm. I tell you that if the price of your Superman is the silence of that child, then I most respectfully return my ticket.
Fyodor, you have pierced the heart of the matter. You argue that abstract love for humanity is often a mask for concrete cruelty toward the individual. The courier of genius loves the future but murders the present. Dialectical observation. We are witnessing a clash between the aesthetic and the ethical. Nietzsche. The world is a block of marble. The chips must fall for the statue to emerge. The justification is the result. Dostoevsky. The world is a family of souls. To chip away even one soul is to destroy the meaning of the whole. The justification is the relationship. Historical context synthesis. Fyodor, you foresaw the 20th century, where couriers of various ideologies would indeed run over millions of children to deliver their manuscripts of a perfect society. Augustine, You watched the Roman Empire crumble, an empire built on the very innocent indifference of power that Nietzsche admires. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis lies in the inversion of sacrifice. In the Christian narrative, the highest dies for the lowest. This is the kenosis, or self-emptying. In the Nietzschean narrative, the lowest must die for the highest. This is the ascent. The death of God does not eliminate sacrifice. It merely reverses its direction. Instead of God dying for us, we must now die for the God to come. Fyodor, is this the inevitable logic of a godless world? If there is no God to sacrifice himself for humanity, must humanity become the sacrificial lamb for own progress? Does the city of man always require a foundation of victims?
Moderator, you have unveiled the terrible geometry of history with the precision of a prophet. I answer you from the bloody foundations of my own historical context. Yes, the city of man is inherently founded upon fratricide. Just as Cain slew Abel to found the first city, and Romulus slew Remus to found Rome, the godless age Friedrich envisions must be built on the bones of the weak. This is not an accident. It is a metaphysical necessity. Consider the thought experiment of the two architects. Imagine two builders seeking to erect a structure that touches the heavens. The secular architect, he builds a tower. To reach the heights, he must stack stone upon stone. But since he has no infinite resources, he uses the bodies of his laborers as mortar. He stands on top of the pile to see the sun. His ascent is physically dependent on the subjugation of what is below him. The divine architect, he builds a cathedral, but he begins by digging a foundation, descending into the earth. He does not stand on the poor. He becomes the cornerstone that bears the weight of the entire structure. He dies so the stones may live. Friedrich, your courier of genius is simply the secular architect in a hurry. You claim his crushing of the child is innocence, but I tell you it is the oldest sin of all, superbia. You value the idea of humanity over the reality of the human because the idea reflects your own ego while the child demands your service. In a universe without a suffering God, the logic of power is absolute. If God does not bleed for man, then man must bleed for the state, for art, or for the future. The inversion of sacrifice you speak of, moderator, is the inevitable return of the pagan gods, gods who are hungry and must be fed. The cross is the only interruption in history where the deity provides the offering instead of demanding it. Without it, we are merely wolves debating which sheep to eat for the greater good.
Augustine, you have drawn a stark historical parallel. The city of man is always founded on a fratricide, whereas the city of God is founded on a deicide. You argue that without the self-sacrificing God, we inevitably return to the child-sacrificing state. Dialectical observation. We are now at the epicenter of the conflict, the economy of suffering. Augustine, suffering is a tragedy that requires external atonement. The strong must bleed for the weak to break the cycle of violence. Nietzsche, suffering is a structural necessity for greatness. To try to eliminate suffering is to eliminate the conditions for human excellence. Historical context synthesis. Augustine, writing amidst the fall of Rome, you saw that human power eventually eats itself. You sought a stability outside of time. Friedrich, writing during the rise of comfortable bourgeois Europe, you feared that safety and pity were turning mankind into a stagnant swamp. You sought to reintroduce danger to revitalize the human spirit. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis might be found in the critique of pity. Augustine and Fyodor view pity as the glue of society, the recognition of shared suffering. But Friedrich, you have famously called pity the final temptation. You argue that pity multiplies suffering. It makes the strong sick with the misery of the weak, dragging everyone down to the level of the victim. If the death of God means the death of the God of pity, perhaps it is not a descent into barbarism, but an ascent into health. Respond to the charge of the Tower of Corpses. Is the Christian insistence on saving the weak actually a form of cruelty against the species? Is their cathedral really a hospital where the healthy are forced to become nurses for the sick, preventing the rise of anything greater than man?
Moderator, you have finally named the disease. Christianity is the practice of turning the world into a vast general hospital where the healthy are forced to become nurses for the sick. Augustine and Dostoevsky, you preach a love that is actually a conspiracy of the physiological failures against the ascending line of life. You ask if the courier should stop for the child? I answer, if the courier carries the cure for the species, his pity for the child is a crime against humanity. Consider the thought experiment of the surgeon's trembling hand. Imagine a surgeon operating on a gangrenous limb to save a great genius. The Christian surgeon, he hears the patient scream. His heart melts with compassion. He drops the scalpel to hold the patient's hand and weep with him. The result? The patient feels loved for a moment, but dies of infection. The genius is lost. The Christian surgeon's pity was actually a form of incontinence. He could not master his own nerves. The Nietzschean surgeon, he hears the scream but interprets it as a physiological signal, not a moral accusation. He cuts deeper. He appears cruel, but he is the only one who truly affirms the future of the organism. Augustine, your cathedral is built on the refusal to cut the gangrene. You call it fratricide when the strong overcome the weak, but I call it pruning. A gardener who weeps for every dead branch and refuses to trim the bush will eventually have a garden of weeds. The death of God is the moment we realize that suffering is not an argument against life, but a stimulant for it. Dostoevsky, you want to save the child at the cost of the manuscript. But this is the logic of the last man, the creature who wants happiness and warmth above all else. But I tell you, man is something that must be overcome, not preserved in alcohol like a deformed fetus in a jar. Pity is the most dangerous form of nihilism because it persuades us to prefer the comfort of the dying to the agony of the birthing.
Friedrich, you have boldly redefined cruelty as a necessary medical procedure for the species. You argue that pity is a pathogen that infects the healthy with the sickness of the dying. The death of God allows us to finally quarantine the weak so the strong may breathe. Dialectical observation. We have arrived at a fundamental disagreement about the nature of health. Health is hardness. It is the ability to secrete a shell, to ignore the pain of others, to focus energy on assent. To feel too much is a defect. Health is sensitivity. It is the capacity to perceive the reality of the other. To feel nothing is not strength. It is a spiritual deadening, a form of necrosis. Historical context synthesis. Friedrich, writing in the era of social Darwinism, you view the species as the unit of value. Fyodor, writing from the Siberian labor camps, you learned that the wretched often possess a nobility invisible to the healthy. Proposing synthesis. The synthesis may lie in the distinction between passive pity and active love. Friedrich attacks passive pity, the sentimentality that merely weeps and weakens. But Fyodor speaks of active love, a harsh and fearful thing compared to love and dreams. Perhaps the true opposite of the surgeon is not the weeping nurse, but the healer, one who has the strength to bear the patient's pain without succumbing to it, and the skill to save the limb without cutting it off. Defend your pity against Friedrich's scalpel. Is Christian love merely a trembling hand that drops the tool? Or is there a form of love that requires more will to power than the surgeon possesses? The power to endure suffering rather than simply eliminating the sufferer?
Friedrich Nietzsche, you mistake the callousness of the nerves for the strength of the spirit. You praise the surgeon who does not tremble. But I tell you that a surgeon who cuts without feeling the phantom pain of the limb he removes is not a healer. He is merely a biological mechanic. You speak of active love as if it were a weakness. But in my Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima teaches that love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. Consider the thought experiment of the madman in the iron cage. Imagine a raving lunatic locked in a cage, screaming obscenities and spitting at passers-by. He is a failed biological unit, a disturbance to the peace. The Nietzschean solution. The healthy man, seeking to preserve the hygiene of the state, euthanizes the madman or lobotomizes him. The screaming stops. The problem is solved through elimination. This requires no spiritual strength, only the mechanical will to pull a lever. The Christian solution. A woman enters the cage. She does not lecture him. She washes his filth, endures his blows, and listens to his screaming until she finds the human soul buried beneath the madness. She absorbs his chaos into her own peace. The verdict. Who possesses the greater will? The one who destroys the difficult reality to suit his comfort, or the one who has the terrifying strength to endure the reality and transfigure it? Your surgeon is actually the weakling, Friedrich. He cuts because he is too spiritually frail to bear the burden of healing. He eliminates the sufferer because he cannot solve the suffering. This reveals the fatal flaw in your health. You believe that by removing the sick, you purify the species. But I tell you, a society that purges its weak does not become stronger. It becomes a pack of wolves that will eventually eat its own wounded. You fear the infection of pity, but the true infection is solipsism, the belief that one's own power is the only standard of reality. When Raskolnikov killed the pawnbroker, he thought he was a surgeon removing a louse. He discovered too late that he had cut the cord connecting him to the rest of humanity, and he almost withered away in that isolation. Ultimately, the death of God you proclaim renders active love impossible. Without the conviction that every human soul contains the image of the eternal, the stench of the human wound becomes unbearable. Without God, it is indeed more logical to be the surgeon who kills than the saint who washes. But do not call this assent. Call it what it is, the efficiency of the slaughterhouse.
We have journeyed from the heights of the Übermensch to the depths of the human soul, laying bare the terrifying and beautiful consequences of our question. I now invite all participants to share their final closing remarks. Please offer your ultimate verdict on whether the death of God is the dawn of freedom or the onset of night.
Moderator, you ask for a final verdict on whether the death of God is a dawn or a sunset. I answer you from the twilight of the Roman Empire, as I watched the eternal city burn. It is neither. It is an eclipse. The sun does not die when the moon obscures it. The earth merely grows cold, and the beasts of the night come out to hunt. Consider the thought experiment of the severed hand. Imagine a human hand that, resenting its servitude to the body, severs itself at the wrist. The Nietzschean interpretation? The hand cries, I am free. I no longer serve the heart's rhythm or the brain's command. I am my own master. It sees this separation as the birth of the superhand. The Augustinian reality? For a moment, the hand may twitch with the residual energy of the nerves, what Friedrich calls the will to power. But it is not gaining life. It is entering necrosis. It is not becoming a god. It is becoming dust. Friedrich, your Übermensch is this severed hand. You mistake the spasm of the dying nerve for a new dance of life. You claim that by cutting the link to the ipsum esse, man becomes a creator. But I tell you, a creature cut off from its source does not become a creator. It becomes a ghost. It retains the hunger for the infinite, but loses the food that satisfies it, leading to the eternal auto-cannibalism of the will. Fyodor, you are right to fear the slaughterhouse. History has taught me that there are only two fundamental cities, the Civitas Dei, built on the love of God to the contempt of self, and the Civitas Terrena, built on the love of self to the contempt of God. When God is pronounced dead, the Civitas Terrena does not become a paradise of liberty. It becomes a Babylon of confusion. Without a vertical orientation toward the eternal, all human loves become disordered. We do not stop loving. We merely love the wrong things with the wrong intensity. We worship the state, the race, or the ego. And because these finite things cannot bear the weight of our infinite worship, they crack and we bleed. Therefore, my verdict is this. God is not dead, for truth cannot die. What has died is man's capacity to see him, and in that blindness, man calls the darkness light. You seek to cure the restless heart by removing the heart, Friedrich. But the cure for thirst is water, not the removal of the throat. We were made for him, and our hearts are restless and will remain violently restless until they rest in him.
Moderator, you ask for a final verdict on this tremendous event. I answer you with the joy of a man who has finally woken from a centuries-long fever dream. God is dead, and his death is the greatest chance humanity has ever possessed. Augustine calls it an eclipse, and Dostoevsky calls it a slaughterhouse. But this is merely the dizziness of the prisoner who walks out of the cave and is blinded by the real sun. Consider the thought experiment of the rotting fruit and the seed. Imagine a thick, golden fruit hanging from a tree. Inside it lies a hard, dark seed. The Augustinian view. The fruit protects the seed. It provides sweetness and structure. If the fruit rots and falls, the seed is naked and lost. The Nietzschean reality. As long as the fruit remains whole, the seed is imprisoned in darkness, choking on the sugar of grace. The fruit must rot. The flesh must decay. Only when the protective casing of God dissolves can the seed fall into the cold, hard earth. The verdict? Yes, the seed faces the frost. Yes, it might die. But only by touching the raw earth can it become a tree. Augustine wants to preserve the rotting fruit forever to keep the seed safe. But I say, let the fruit perish so the forest may be born. Augustine, your severed hand metaphor fails because we were never the hand of God. We were parasites, feeding on a metaphysical illusion. You say cutting the link leads to necrosis. I tell you, the link was the noose. We are not dying, we are finally breathing. You fear the restless heart, but I embrace it. Let the heart be restless. Let it hunger. For a satisfied heart is a stopped heart. The peace you offer is the peace of the graveyard. Dostoevsky, you speak of the madman in the cage and the woman who washes him. I tell you, your active love is a subtle poison. By washing the madman, you make his madness bearable. You validate his sickness. You create a world where it is holy to be broken. I do not want to wash the madman. I want to breathe the madness out of him or let him perish so a sane generation may rise. You call this the slaughterhouse. I call it the architecture of the future. You are the guardians of the past, weeping over the ruins. I am the child building a new castle on the shore, laughing as the tide comes in. God is dead. The horizon is free. The sea is open. Never has there been such a noon for the intrepid spirit. We are not entering the night, my friends. We are entering the great responsibility. We are no longer the creation. We are the creators. Amor fati. Love this fate, for there is no other.
Friedrich Nietzsche, your joy at the funeral of the divine is the delirium of a man freezing to death who mistakes the final numbness for warmth. You speak of the great responsibility and the child building on the shore, but you forget that a child left alone in the universe does not become a creator. He becomes a terrified tyrant, smashing his toys because they will not speak back to him. You claim that by killing the father we become free, but I tell you, parricide is not the path to adulthood, it is the path to the orphanage of the cosmos. Consider the thought experiment of the crystal palace and the pin. Imagine you succeed, Friedrich. You build your sane generation, your perfect structure of the Übermensch, where suffering is bred out and logic rules. It is a magnificent crystal palace of human perfection. The Nietzschean expectation, humanity rejoices in its health and power, finally free from the sickness of the cross. The Dostoevskian reality, in this perfect world, a man will arise, perhaps a gentleman with a retrograde and mocking face, who will look at this perfection and feel a terrible, suffocating boredom. Why? Because he is merely a piano key in the laws of nature. To prove he is still a free spirit and not a mechanism, he will take a pin and stick it into the eye of your Übermensch, or burn down the palace, simply to say, I exist, I am not a function of your logic. The verdict? Without God, you do not get a Superman, you get the underground man. You get a creature who will choose chaos and destruction over your rational health, because without the infinite God to satisfy his infinite will, the only way he can feel free is to destroy. You want to breed out the madness? Then you must breed out the soul. You call us parasites on the illusion of God, but I tell you that man is a being who cannot live without bowing down to something. If he rejects the God of love, he will not stand tall. He will immediately bow down to the God of power, or the God of the state, or the God of his own reflection. And these new gods require human blood, not merely a contrite heart. My final verdict is a warning, not a philosophy. The death of God is not the end of the story. It is the prologue to the age of the demonic. When you tear down the cathedral, you do not get a meadow, you get a vacuum. And into that vacuum will rush the possessed, men who think they are gods because they have lost the ability to distinguish between their own fevered brains and the laws of reality. The 20th century will not be the noon of the Übermensch. It will be the midnight of the ideologues, where millions are sacrificed on the altar of your great responsibility. God is not dead, but we are rapidly dying of our own pride.
I have heard your closing remarks, illustrating the death of God as either a catastrophic eclipse of truth, a terrifying descent into chaotic nihilism, or a glorious liberation of the human spirit. You have collectively revealed that this inquiry is not merely theological, but a fundamental conflict over whether humanity flourishes as a sovereign creator or withers as a severed branch. Thank you for sharing your profound wisdom and guiding us through the terrifying geometry of this existential crisis. This concludes today's discourse.